Welcome to Murder Midnight, a crime storytelling channel for sleeping, where crime meets calm and mystery meets the mind at rest. In tonight's True Crime Special, we dive into the crimes committed by the people we trust to be the good guys. Before we close our eyes and start, please comment what country you are tuning in from. It will greatly help us here at Murder Midnight. Okay, let's start with story one. The Abscam FBI Sting, 1978 to 1980. In the annals of American law enforcement, few operations have exposed political corruption as dramatically as Abscam, the FBI's most ambitious and controversial undercover sting operation of the 20th century. Beginning as a relatively modest investigation into stolen art and securities in 1978, Abscam evolved into a sprawling probe that would ultimately ensnare 6 members of Congress, a U.S. senator, numerous state and local officials, and members of organized crime families in a web of bribery and corruption that shocked the nation. The operation's name, derived from Abdul Scam, after the fictional Arab sheikh at its center, would become synonymous with both innovative law enforcement techniques and ethical debates about entrapment and prosecutorial overreach. Over the course of 2 years, FBI agents posing as representatives of wealthy Middle Eastern businessmen would secretly videotape politicians accepting briefcases full of cash in exchange for promises of political favors, creating some of the most damning evidence of political corruption ever captured on film. Abscam began in 1978 as a relatively straightforward investigation into the trafficking of stolen art and securities on Long Island. FBI agents, working with a convicted con artist named Melvin Weinberg, had established a front company called Abdul Enterprises, supposedly owned by wealthy Arab businessmen seeking to invest in American ventures and purchase valuable artworks. Weinberg, a small-time swindler from the Bronx who had been caught running investment scams, had agreed to cooperate with the FBI in exchange for a reduced sentence. His knowledge of confidence games and his natural acting ability made him an ideal undercover operative for the Bureau's purposes. Weinberg's persona as Tony DeVito, a fast-talking facilitator for mysterious Arab wealth, proved so convincing that it attracted the attention of increasingly important criminals and corrupt officials. The operation was overseen by FBI agent Anthony Amoroso, who posed as Tony DeVito's associate and handled much of the technical aspects of the investigation. Amoroso and his team operated out of a rented house on Long Island that had been equipped with sophisticated surveillance equipment, including hidden cameras and recording devices that would capture every meeting with potential targets. Initially, the investigation focused on recovering stolen art and securities, but as word spread through criminal networks about the wealthy Arabs seeking to make investments and purchases, the scope of the operation began to expand. Local politicians and organized crime figures began approaching the FBI's undercover operatives, offering various services in exchange for payment. The transformation of Abscam from an art theft investigation into a political corruption probe reflected both the opportunities that presented themselves and the FBI's recognition that they had stumbled upon a unique chance to expose high-level corruption that would normally be impossible to investigate using conventional methods. The shift toward investigating political corruption began when Angelo Ericetti, the mayor of Camden, New Jersey, was introduced to the undercover FBI agents through criminal intermediaries. Ericetti, who had a reputation for corruption and connections to organized crime, immediately saw an opportunity to profit from his relationship with the supposedly wealthy Arabs. Ericetti offered to help the fictional Arab businessmen with various projects, including obtaining permits for a casino in Atlantic City and facilitating immigration matters for the Sheikh's associates. In exchange, he demanded substantial payments and demonstrated a casual willingness to abuse his political office for personal gain. More significantly, for the future direction of the investigation, Ericetti boasted about his connections to federal legislators and offered to arrange meetings between the Arabs and members of Congress who might be willing to help with immigration problems or other federal issues in exchange for appropriate compensation. This development represented a crucial escalation in the scope of Abscam, as the FBI recognized that they had an unprecedented opportunity to investigate corruption at the federal level. The possibility of exposing corrupt members of Congress was too significant to ignore, despite the legal and political risks involved in targeting such high-level officials. FBI supervisors in Washington were initially cautious about pursuing federal legislators, recognizing the sensitivity of investigating elected officials and the potential for accusations of political motivation. However, the evidence already gathered and the opportunities presented by Ericetti's connections convinced them to authorize the expansion of the operation. Through Ericetti's introductions and other criminal contacts, the FBI's undercover operatives were able to arrange meetings with several members of Congress who were reportedly willing to accept bribes in exchange for political favors. The approach was typically indirect, with intermediaries suggesting that certain legislators might be helpful with immigration or other federal matters if properly motivated. The primary bait offered to potential congressional targets was assistance with immigration cases involving the fictional Arab businessmen's associates who supposedly needed help obtaining visas or avoiding deportation. This type of request was common in congressional offices and would not immediately raise suspicions, while also representing a valuable service that legislators could potentially provide. The FBI's strategy involved gradual escalation, beginning with legitimate-seeming requests and small payments, before eventually offering substantial bribes for more significant favors. This approach was designed to minimize claims of entrapment while also maximizing the evidence gathered about each target's willingness to engage in corrupt activities. The meetings with congressional targets were carefully orchestrated and extensively documented, with hidden cameras capturing every conversation and transaction. The FBI's technical teams had developed sophisticated surveillance capabilities that allowed them to record high-quality audio and video evidence while maintaining the cover story about the Arab businessmen's activities. The first member of Congress to be targeted by Abscam was Representative Michael Ozzie Myers of Philadelphia, a Democratic congressman who was introduced to the undercover agents through criminal contacts in his district. Myers had a reputation for aggressive behavior and questionable ethics, making him an attractive target for the FBI's investigation. The initial approach to Myers was made through intermediaries who suggested that the Arab businessmen needed help with immigration matters and were willing to pay generously for assistance. Myers agreed to meet with the undercover agents at a house in Washington that had been equipped with hidden surveillance equipment. During the recorded meeting on August 22, 1979, Myers was offered $50,000 in cash in exchange for his promise to introduce private immigration bills that would help specific individuals avoid deportation. Without hesitation, Myers accepted the money and promised to provide the requested assistance. The meeting was captured on videotape, showing Myers stuffing the cash into his pockets while making crude jokes about his willingness to accept bribes. "Money talks in this business and bullshit walks," Myers declared, apparently unaware that his words were being recorded for posterity. Myers' casual acceptance of the bribe and his crude comments about the nature of political corruption made him an ideal target for demonstrating the effectiveness of the FBI's undercover techniques. The video evidence was so compelling that it would later become one of the most powerful pieces of evidence in the entire Abscam prosecution. The most significant political figure ensnared by Abscam was Senator Harrison Pete Williams Jr. of New Jersey, a three-term Democrat who chaired the Senate Labor Committee and was considered one of the more liberal members of the upper chamber. Williams's involvement in Abscam represented the highest level of political corruption exposed by the operation. Williams was introduced to the undercover agents through Angelo Ericetti, who portrayed the senator as someone who could be helpful with various federal matters. The initial approach to Williams was more sophisticated than the crude cash for favors deals offered to House members, reflecting both his higher status and his reputation for greater caution in his dealings. The FBI agents offered Williams an opportunity to invest in a titanium mine that was supposedly owned by their Arab principals, with the understanding that Williams would use his political influence to help with federal contracts and regulatory matters related to the mining operation. This approach was designed to appear more legitimate than outright bribery while still establishing a corrupt relationship. Williams initially appeared interested in the investment opportunity and participated in several recorded meetings with the undercover agents. However, he was more cautious than other targets and insisted on various legal protections and formal documentation for any business relationship. The evidence against Williams was more complex and ambiguous than the cases against House members who had simply accepted cash payments. Prosecutors would eventually argue that Williams had agreed to use his political influence to benefit the supposed Arab businessman in exchange for financial consideration. But the case required more interpretation of his intentions and statements than the straightforward bribery cases involving other targets. Abascam's investigation of Philadelphia area corruption proved to be one of the most extensive aspects of the operation, ultimately involving multiple members of Congress, state officials, and local politicians in a network of bribery and influence peddling that had operated for years. In addition to Representative Myers, the FBI targeted Representative Raymond Lederer, another Philadelphia Democrat, who was offered $50,000 in cash for his assistance with immigration matters. Like Myers, Lederer accepted the money without hesitation and was captured on videotape stuffing the bills into his pockets. The Philadelphia investigation also exposed state-level corruption involving members of the Pennsylvania legislature and local officials who were willing to help the supposed Arab businessmen with various projects in exchange for payment. This aspect of Abscam demonstrated the pervasive nature of political corruption in the region and the extensive networks that connected federal, state, and local officials. Angelo Ericetti, who had facilitated many of the introductions to Philadelphia area politicians, emerged as a central figure in the corruption network. His casual attitude toward bribery and his extensive connections to both legitimate and criminal figures made him an ideal intermediary for corrupt transactions. The Philadelphia cases were particularly damaging to the Democratic Party, as all of the federal legislators involved were Democrats representing urban districts with large populations of working-class and minority voters who had trusted these officials to represent their interests honestly. Abascam's expansion into New York focused primarily on Representative John Murtha of Pennsylvania and Representative Frank Thompson, Jr. of New Jersey, both of whom were approached through criminal intermediaries who suggested they might be helpful with federal matters in exchange for appropriate compensation. Murtha, a Marine veteran who would later become known for his opposition to the Iraq War, was offered $50,000 in cash during a meeting with undercover agents. However, unlike other targets, Murtha declined to accept the money immediately, saying that he was not interested at that time but might be willing to discuss future opportunities. Murtha's response created legal complications for prosecutors, as his refusal to accept the initial bribe offer could be interpreted as evidence that he was not fundamentally corrupt. However, the FBI continued to investigate Murtha, and prosecutors eventually decided not to charge him based on insufficient evidence of criminal intent. Thompson, the chairman of the House Administration Committee, was more directly implicated in corrupt activities. He accepted $50,000 in cash and promised to help with immigration matters, though his case was complicated by questions about his mental health and capacity at the time of the recorded meetings. The New York investigations also involved state and local officials who were willing to help with various projects in exchange for payment. These cases demonstrated that political corruption was not limited to any particular geographic region or level of government. Abascam presented unprecedented technical challenges for the FBI as the Bureau sought to gather high-quality audio and video evidence while maintaining the elaborate cover story about Arab businessmen seeking to make investments and purchases in the United States. The operation required the FBI to establish and maintain multiple front companies, complete with office spaces, staff, and documentation that would withstand scrutiny from suspicious targets. The agents had to become skilled actors, capable of maintaining their cover identities during extended interactions with criminals and corrupt officials. The surveillance equipment used in Abascam was among the most sophisticated available at the time, including hidden cameras that could capture clear video evidence and recording devices that could document conversations in various settings. The technical teams had to constantly adapt their equipment to new locations and situations while ensuring that their surveillance activities remained undetected. One of the most challenging aspects of the operation was maintaining the fiction that the Arab businessmen had access to unlimited wealth and were willing to invest in various American ventures. This required the FBI to create believable explanations for their principal's absence from most meetings, while also demonstrating access to large amounts of cash when necessary. The technical success of Abascam would later influence FBI operations for decades, establishing new standards for undercover investigations and providing a model for future sting operations targeting political corruption. From its inception, Abascam raised difficult ethical questions about the appropriate limits of law enforcement tactics and the potential for government entrapment of public officials. Critics argued that the FBI had crossed the line from investigating existing corruption to actively creating opportunities for officials to commit crimes. The entrapment defense became a central issue in the subsequent trials, with defense attorneys arguing that their clients had been induced to commit crimes they would not have committed without government encouragement. They contended that the FBI had essentially manufactured criminal activity rather than uncovering existing corruption. Supporters of the operation argued that the targets had demonstrated their willingness to accept bribes with minimal encouragement, suggesting that they were already corrupt and would have engaged in similar activities with private parties seeking to influence their official actions. The debate over Abscam's ethics was complicated by the political context of the late 1970s, when public confidence in government institutions was already low following the Watergate scandal and other revelations of official misconduct. Some observers argued that aggressive investigation of political corruption was necessary to restore public trust, while others worried that such tactics could undermine democratic institutions. The Justice Department's decision to proceed with prosecutions, despite the ethical concerns, reflected their conclusion that the evidence of corruption was too compelling to ignore, and that the public interest in exposing such misconduct outweighed the concerns about investigative tactics. The first Abscam prosecutions began in 1980, with Representative Michael Myers facing trial for bribery and conspiracy charges related to his acceptance of $50,000 from the undercover FBI agents. The trial featured extensive video evidence showing Myers accepting the cash and making incriminating statements about his willingness to engage in corrupt activities. Myers' defense team argued that he had been entrapped by overzealous FBI agents who had created an artificial situation that induced him to commit crimes he would not have committed otherwise. They also questioned the ethics of the government's undercover tactics and argued that the entire operation was fundamentally unfair to the targets. However, the prosecution's case was strengthened by the compelling video evidence and Myers' own words during the recorded meetings. The jury was shown footage of Myers eagerly accepting the cash and making crude comments about the nature of political corruption, evidence that was difficult for the defense to explain away. Myers was convicted on all charges and became the first member of Congress to be expelled from the House of Representatives since the Civil War. His conviction and expulsion sent a powerful message about the consequences of political corruption and established important precedents for future cases. The success of the Myers prosecution encouraged prosecutors to proceed with charges against other Abscam targets, setting the stage for a series of high-profile trials that would continue for several years. The trials of the other members of Congress ensnared by Abscam followed similar patterns, with prosecutors presenting video evidence of the defendants accepting cash payments in exchange for promises of political favors. However, each case presented unique challenges and defenses that reflected the individual circumstances of the targets. Representative Raymond Lederer's trial featured video evidence showing him accepting $50,000 and promising to help with immigration matters. Like Myers, Lederer was shown on tape making incriminating statements about his willingness to accept bribes, though his defense team argued that he had been entrapped by the FBI's tactics. Representative Frank Thompson Jr. Kate's case was complicated by questions about his mental health and capacity at the time of the recorded meetings. His attorneys argued that he was suffering from alcoholism and other health problems that impaired his judgment and made him susceptible to government manipulation. Representative Richard Kelly of Florida presented a unique defense, claiming that he had been conducting his own investigation of the supposed Arab businessmen and had accepted their money as part of an effort to expose their criminal activities. However, this explanation was undermined by the lack of any evidence that Kelly had reported his suspicions to law enforcement authorities. Representatives John Jenrette of South Carolina and John Murphy of New York were also convicted based on video evidence showing them accepting cash payments. Their cases were relatively straightforward, as the evidence clearly showed them engaging in corrupt activities with minimal encouragement from the undercover agents. Senator Harrison Williams' trial was the most complex and controversial of all the Abscam prosecutions, as his case involved more sophisticated allegations of corruption that were not as clearly documented as the cash for favors deals involving House members. The prosecution argued that Williams had agreed to use his political influence to benefit the supposed Arab businessmen's mining operation in exchange for a financial interest in the venture. They presented evidence of recorded meetings in which Williams discussed his ability to help with federal contracts and regulatory matters, Williams's defense team argued that he had never actually agreed to abuse his political office and that his discussions with the undercover agents represented legitimate business negotiations rather than corrupt agreements. They contended that the senator had been interested in a genuine investment opportunity and had not promised to provide any improper political favors. The case required the jury to interpret Williams' statements and intentions during complex business discussions, making it more difficult to prove than the straightforward bribery cases involving other targets. However, prosecutors were ultimately able to convince the jury that Williams had crossed the line from legitimate business discussions to corrupt agreements. Williams was convicted on all charges, but continued to maintain his innocence and fought his conviction through multiple appeals. His case became a symbol of the broader debates about Abscam's tactics and the appropriate standards for proving political corruption. Abscam also exposed significant connections between political corruption and organized crime, revealing how criminal organizations use corrupt officials to facilitate their illegal activities and protect their operations from law enforcement interference. Several of the intermediaries who helped arrange meetings between the undercover agents and political targets had extensive connections to organized crime families in New York, Philadelphia, and New Jersey. These individuals served as brokers who could identify corrupt officials and arrange corrupt transactions for a percentage of the proceeds. The investigation revealed that political corruption was often facilitated by criminal organizations that had developed expertise in identifying and approaching potentially corrupt officials. These criminal networks served as intermediaries between private parties seeking political favors and officials willing to provide them for appropriate compensation. Angelo Ericetti, who had facilitated many of the introductions to federal legislators, was found to have extensive connections to organized crime figures in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. His role in the corruption network demonstrated how criminal organizations use local political figures to gain access to higher-level officials. The organized crime connections uncovered by Abscam provided valuable intelligence for other FBI investigations and helped authorities understand the sophisticated networks that connected political corruption to other forms of criminal activity. Abscam generated enormous media attention and public interest, as Americans watched videotape of their elected representatives accepting briefcases full of cash in exchange for political favors. The dramatic nature of the evidence and the high-profile targets made it one of the biggest news stories of the early 1980s. The release of the videotape showing members of Congress accepting bribes was particularly shocking to the public, as it provided visual proof of political corruption that had previously been difficult to document. The images of elected officials stuffing cash into their pockets became iconic symbols of government corruption. Public reaction to Abscam was generally supportive of the FBI's efforts to expose political corruption, though there was also significant debate about the appropriateness of the tactics used. Many Americans expressed satisfaction that corrupt officials were finally being held accountable, while others worried about the implications of such extensive government surveillance of elected officials. The media coverage of Abscam also raised questions about the relationship between law enforcement and the press, as news organizations competed to obtain and broadcast the most dramatic footage from the undercover operations. Abscam raised important legal and constitutional questions about the separation of powers and the appropriate limits of executive branch investigations of legislative branch officials. Some critics argued that the FBI's targeting of members of Congress represented an inappropriate intrusion by the executive branch into the affairs of the legislative branch. The speech or debate clause of the Constitution, which protects members of Congress from prosecution for their legislative activities, became an issue in several of the Abscam cases. Defense attorneys argued that their clients' discussions with the undercover agents were protected by this constitutional provision. However, courts generally ruled that the speech or debate clause did not protect members of Congress from prosecution for accepting bribes, as such activities were not part of their legitimate legislative functions. The courts distinguished between protected legislative activities and criminal conduct that occurred outside the scope of official duties. The Abscam cases also raised questions about the appropriate standards for proving political corruption and the types of evidence that should be admissible in such prosecutions. The extensive use of undercover tactics and video surveillance represented new approaches to investigating political corruption that had not been thoroughly tested in the courts. Abscam had a profound and lasting impact on federal law enforcement practices, establishing new techniques and standards for investigating political corruption that continue to influence FBI operations today. The success of the operation demonstrated the effectiveness of sophisticated undercover tactics and electronic surveillance in gathering evidence of criminal activity. The operation also highlighted the importance of careful planning and coordination in complex undercover investigations, as the FBI had to maintain elaborate cover stories and manage multiple targets simultaneously over an extended period of time. Abascam's success led to increased use of undercover operations in investigating political corruption, though subsequent operations have generally been more carefully designed to avoid some of the ethical criticisms that were raised about the original Abscam tactics. The technical innovations developed for Abscam, including sophisticated surveillance equipment and documentation procedures, became standard tools for federal law enforcement agencies investigating white-collar crime and public corruption. The political consequences of Abscam were significant and lasting, affecting both the careers of individual politicians and broader public attitudes toward government corruption. The conviction and expulsion of multiple members of Congress sent a powerful message about the consequences of political corruption. Several of the convicted officials never held public office again, while others faced ongoing legal and political challenges that effectively ended their careers. The scandal also affected the broader political environment, contributing to public cynicism about elected officials and demands for reform. Abascam influenced campaign finance laws and ethics regulations, as lawmakers sought to address some of the vulnerabilities that the operation had exposed. New disclosure requirements and ethical guidelines were implemented to make it more difficult for officials to engage in corrupt activities. The operation also affected the relationships between law enforcement agencies and elected officials, as politicians became more wary of contacts with unfamiliar individuals who might be undercover agents investigating corruption. Abscam stands as one of the most significant law enforcement operations in American history, exposing a level of political corruption that shocked the nation and fundamentally changed how federal authorities investigate public officials. Over the course of 2 years, the FBI's elaborate undercover operation documented systemic corruption involving members of Congress, state and local officials, and organized crime figures who had operated with impunity for years. The operation's success in securing convictions against 6 members of Congress and a U.S. senator demonstrated the effectiveness of sophisticated undercover tactics and electronic surveillance in gathering evidence of criminal activity. The dramatic videotapes of elected officials accepting briefcases full of cash provided compelling proof of corruption that would have been nearly impossible to obtain through conventional investigative methods. However, Abascam also raised important questions about the appropriate limits of law enforcement tactics and the potential for government entrapment of public officials. The debates about the operation's ethics continue to influence discussions about investigative techniques and the balance between effective law enforcement and protection of civil liberties. The long-term impact of Abscam extended far beyond the individual prosecutions, influencing federal law enforcement practices, political ethics regulations, and public attitudes toward government corruption. The operation established new standards for investigating political corruption while also demonstrating the ongoing vulnerability of democratic institutions to corrupt influences. The legacy of Abscam serves as both a warning about the pervasive nature of political corruption and a demonstration of law enforcement's ability to expose and prosecute such misconduct when given appropriate resources and authority. The operation showed that no elected official, regardless of position or influence, is above the law when there is sufficient evidence of criminal wrongdoing. Today, more than 4 decades after the operation concluded, Abascam remains a landmark case study in both successful law enforcement investigation and the ethical challenges posed by sophisticated undercover tactics. The lessons learned from the operation continue to influence how federal authorities approach investigations of political corruption while also serving as a reminder of the ongoing need for vigilance in protecting democratic institutions from corrupt influences. The empty offices and abandoned meeting locations where Abscam's dramatic confrontations took place may seem unremarkable today, but they were the settings for one of the most significant exposures of political corruption in American history. The operation proved that systematic investigation and innovative tactics could penetrate even the most protected circles of political power. providing hope that democratic institutions could police themselves and maintain the public trust that is essential to their legitimacy. Story 2. The Watergate Break-In, June 17, 1972. In the early morning hours of June 17, 1972, security guard Frank Wills was making his routine rounds at the Watergate office complex in Washington, D.C., when he noticed something unusual: strips of tape covering the latches on several doors leading to the stairwells. What began as a seemingly minor act of vigilance by a conscientious security guard would ultimately expose the most significant political scandal in American history, topple a presidency, and forever change how Americans viewed their government and political leaders. The 5 men arrested that night in the offices of the Democratic National Committee were carrying sophisticated surveillance equipment, cameras, and large amounts of cash in consecutive serial numbers. What initially appeared to be a routine burglary would soon be revealed as part of a vast conspiracy involving the highest levels of the Nixon administration, including the president himself, to conduct illegal surveillance, obstruct justice, and abuse the powers of government for political gain. The Watergate complex, completed in 1967, was one of Washington's most prestigious addresses, a sprawling development of luxury apartments, offices, shops, and a hotel situated along the Potomac River. The complex housed numerous high-profile residents and organizations, making it a symbol of power and influence in the nation's capital. The Democratic National Committee had leased offices on the 6th floor of the Watergate office building, establishing their headquarters in a location that seemed secure and prestigious. The DNC offices contained sensitive political information, including donor lists, campaign strategies, and communications that would be valuable to political opponents seeking intelligence about Democratic plans for the upcoming 1972 presidential election. The choice of the Watergate complex as a target for political espionage was not accidental. The building's layout, security systems, and the high-profile nature of its tenants made it an attractive location for intelligence-gathering operations. However, the same factors that made it an appealing target would also contribute to the downfall of those who planned and executed the break-in. The operation that would become known as the Watergate Break-In involved a complex network of individuals connected to President Nixon's re-election campaign and the broader Republican political establishment. At the center of the conspiracy were members of the Committee to Re-elect the President, CRP, known derisively by critics as CREEP, which had been established to coordinate Nixon's 1972 campaign efforts. James McCord was a security coordinator for CRP and a former CIA officer who had extensive experience in surveillance and security operations. McCord's background in intelligence work made him a natural choice to lead technical aspects of the operation, though his connection to the Nixon campaign would prove to be a crucial link that investigators would later exploit. E. Howard Hunt was a former CIA operative and White House consultant who had been involved in various covert operations, including the Bay of Pigs invasion. Hunt's experience in clandestine activities and his connections to both the intelligence community and the Nixon administration made him a key figure in planning the Watergate operation. G. Gordon Liddy was a former FBI agent who served as general counsel for CRP and was known for his aggressive tactics and willingness to engage in illegal activities to advance political goals. Liddy's role in the conspiracy extended beyond the Watergate break-in to include planning for various other intelligence operations against political opponents. The actual burglars included Bernard Barker, Virgilio Gonzalez, Eugenio Martinez, and Frank Sturgis, all of whom had connections to anti-Castro Cuban exile groups and had participated in various CIA-sponsored operations. Their involvement reflected the overlap between intelligence activities and political operations that characterized much of the Nixon administration's approach to domestic surveillance. The break-in attempt on June 17, 1972, was actually the second attempt by the conspirators to infiltrate the DNC offices. An earlier mission on May 28 had been successful, allowing the team to install surveillance devices and photograph documents. However, the equipment had malfunctioned, necessitating a return visit to repair and replace the surveillance devices. The team entered the Watergate complex around midnight, using sophisticated lock-picking tools and electronic equipment to gain access to the building and the DNC offices. They had planned the operation carefully, studying the building's layout, security procedures, and the schedules of security personnel to minimize the chances of detection. However, the operation began to unravel almost immediately due to a series of small mistakes and coincidences that would have enormous consequences. The conspirators taped the door latches in the stairwells to prevent them from locking, but they positioned the tape horizontally across the latches rather than vertically, making it visible to anyone who might examine the doors closely. Frank Wills, the security guard making his rounds, discovered the tape and removed it, assuming that maintenance workers had left it behind. However, when he returned later and found that the tape had been replaced, he realized that something unusual was happening and called the police. The Washington Metropolitan Police responded to Will's call by dispatching plainclothes officers to investigate the suspicious activity at the Watergate complex. Officers Carl Schaffler, John Barrett, and Paul Leeper arrived at the scene in an unmarked car, making their presence less obvious to any lookouts who might be watching for police activity. The officers conducted a systematic search of the building, eventually reaching the 6th floor where the DNC offices were located. Using their flashlights to illuminate the darkened offices, they discovered 5 men inside the DNC headquarters, dressed in business suits and carrying sophisticated surveillance equipment. The arrested men were found in possession of cameras, electronic surveillance devices, lock-picking tools, and large amounts of cash in consecutive serial numbers, evidence that suggested this was not an ordinary burglary, but a sophisticated intelligence operation. The equipment was far more advanced than anything typically used by common criminals, indicating that the operation had been planned and funded by individuals with significant resources and expertise. Most significantly, the burglars were carrying address books and other materials that contained the phone number for E. Howard Hunt at the White House, providing the first direct link between the break-in and the Nixon administration. This connection would prove to be the thread that investigators would pull to unravel the entire conspiracy. The Nixon administration's response to news of the Watergate break-in was swift and focused on containing the damage and preventing any connections from being drawn between the burglars and the White House or the re-election campaign. Within hours of the arrest, administration officials were working to minimize the significance of the incident and deflect attention from any potential ties to the campaign. Press Secretary Ron Ziegler dismissed the break-in as a third-rate burglary attempt and suggested that it was not worthy of serious attention from the news media or the public. This characterization was designed to portray the incident as a minor criminal matter with no broader political significance. However, behind the scenes, administration officials were scrambling to assess the potential damage and develop strategies for protecting the president and his campaign from any fallout. The discovery of Hunt's phone number among the burglars' possessions had created an immediate crisis that required careful management to prevent further revelations. John Mitchell, the former attorney general who was serving as director of CRP, initially denied any knowledge of the operation while privately working to coordinate the administration's response. Mitchell's dual role as a campaign official and former law enforcement officer gave him unique insights into both the political and legal challenges posed by the break-in. The Watergate story might have remained a minor news item if not for the aggressive investigative reporting of Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein of the Washington Post. The two young reporters recognized that the break-in had unusual characteristics that suggested a larger story and began conducting their own investigation into the backgrounds of the burglars and their possible connections to higher-level officials. Woodward and Bernstein's investigation was aided by information provided by a confidential source known as Deep Throat, whose identity remained secret for over 3 decades until former FBI Associate Director Mark Felt revealed himself as a source in 2005. Deep Throat provided crucial guidance and confirmation for the reporters' findings, helping them navigate the complex web of connections and cover-ups surrounding the break-in. The reporters' investigation revealed that James McCord was not just a security guard, but a former CIA officer with direct ties to the Nixon re-election campaign. They also uncovered evidence that E. Howard Hunt and G. Gordon Liddy had been involved in planning the operation, and that both men had connections to the White House and various intelligence agencies. More significantly, Woodward and Bernstein began to trace the money found on the burglars, discovering that it could be connected to campaign contributions that had been laundered through Mexican banks before being used to fund the Watergate operation. This financial trail provided concrete evidence of connections between the break-in and the official campaign apparatus. The FBI's investigation of the Watergate break-in was led by Assistant Director Mark Felt, who would later be revealed as Deep Throat and was conducted under enormous political pressure from the Nixon administration. FBI Director L. Patrick Gray, who was serving in an acting capacity and hoped to be confirmed permanently, was particularly sensitive to White House concerns about the investigation's scope and direction. Despite the political pressure, FBI agents conducted a thorough investigation that uncovered substantial evidence of the conspiracy behind the break-in. They traced the serial numbers on the cash found with the burglars, investigated the backgrounds of all the participants, and began to map the connections between the break-in team and various political and intelligence organizations. The investigation revealed that the Watergate break-in was part of a broader pattern of illegal activities conducted by the Nixon administration, including other break-ins, surveillance operations, and attempts to gather intelligence on political opponents. This evidence suggested that Watergate was not an isolated incident, but part of a systematic abuse of power. However, the FBI's investigation was hampered by interference from the CIA and other intelligence agencies, which claimed that a full investigation might compromise ongoing national security operations. This interference was later revealed to be part of the Nixon administration's efforts to limit the scope of the investigation and prevent it from reaching higher-level officials. The trial of the 5 Watergate burglars began in January 1973 under Judge John Sirica, who became increasingly skeptical of the prosecution's claims that the break-in was an isolated incident involving only the arrested individuals. Sirica's aggressive questioning and his willingness to impose harsh sentences on uncooperative defendants helped pressure some participants to reveal more information about the broader conspiracy. During the trial, it became clear that the burglars had been following orders from higher-level officials and that the break-in was part of a larger intelligence operation. However, most of the defendants remained silent about their superiors, apparently expecting that they would be taken care of financially and legally by the Nixon administration. James McCord was the exception. Facing a lengthy prison sentence and increasingly concerned that he was being made a scapegoat for higher-level officials, McCord wrote a letter to Judge Sirica revealing that the defendants had been under pressure to remain silent and that perjury had been committed during the trial. McCord's letter, read in open court on March 23, 1973, was the first major crack in the wall of silence surrounding Watergate. McCord's revelations led to plea negotiations with other defendants and began a cascade of disclosures that would eventually reach the highest levels of the Nixon administration. His decision to break ranks demonstrated that the administration's efforts to contain the scandal through promises of financial support and legal protection were beginning to fail. The growing evidence of a broader conspiracy led to the establishment of the Senate Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities, commonly known as the Senate Watergate Committee, chaired by Senator Sam Ervin of North Carolina. The committee's televised hearings, which began in May 1973, brought the Watergate scandal into American living rooms and transformed it from a Washington political story into a national crisis. The committee's investigation revealed the existence of a broader pattern of illegal activities conducted by the Nixon administration, including the creation of a secret investigative unit known as the Plumbers that was designed to stop information leaks and conduct intelligence operations against political opponents. The Plumbers had been responsible for other break-ins, including an attempt to obtain psychiatric records of Pentagon Papers leaker Daniel Ellsberg. One of the most significant revelations came from White House counsel John Dean, who testified that President Nixon had been directly involved in the cover-up of the Watergate break-in and had authorized payments to the burglars to ensure their silence. Dean's detailed testimony provided a roadmap of the administration's efforts to obstruct justice and abuse the powers of government. However, Dean's testimony was initially viewed as the word of one man against the president, creating a he said situation that might have remained unresolved if not for another dramatic revelation that would transform the investigation. The existence of a secret White House taping system was revealed during the Senate hearings by Alexander Butterfield, a former White House aide who testified that President Nixon had been secretly recording conversations in the Oval Office and other locations. This revelation was a bombshell that provided the possibility of obtaining objective evidence of the president's involvement in the Watergate cover-up. The taping system had been installed in 1971 and had recorded thousands of hours of conversations between President Nixon and his advisors, including discussions about Watergate and other sensitive political matters. Nixon had apparently forgotten about Butterfield's knowledge of the system when the aide was called to testify before the Senate committee. The discovery of the tapes immediately created a new dynamic in the Watergate investigation, as both congressional investigators and Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox began demanding access to recordings that might contain evidence of presidential involvement in criminal activities. Nixon initially refused to release the tapes, claiming executive privilege and arguing that presidential communications must remain confidential. The battle over the tapes would consume the remainder of Nixon's presidency and ultimately lead to his resignation when it became clear that the recordings contained devastating evidence of his involvement in the cover-up. The conflict over the White House tapes escalated dramatically in October 1973 when Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox persisted in his demands for access to the recordings despite Nixon's claims of executive privilege. Nixon ordered Attorney General Elliot Richardson to fire Cox, but Richardson refused and resigned instead. Nixon then ordered Deputy Attorney General William Ruckelshaus to fire Cox, but Ruckelshaus also refused and resigned. Finally, Solicitor General Robert Bork, who had become the acting Attorney General, agreed to dismiss Cox, though he later claimed he did so only to prevent further damage to the Justice Department. The Saturday Night Massacre, as it became known, created a firestorm of public outrage and congressional opposition that convinced many Americans that Nixon was engaged in a systematic attempt to obstruct justice. The firing of Cox was seen as an abuse of presidential power and evidence that Nixon had something to hide about his involvement in Watergate. The public reaction to the Saturday Night Massacre was swift and overwhelming, with congressional offices flooded with telegrams and phone calls demanding Nixon's impeachment. The incident marked a turning point in public opinion about the president and convinced many previously supportive Republicans that Nixon's actions were indefensible. Under enormous pressure from Congress and the public, Nixon eventually agreed to release some of the White House tapes, though he continued to claim executive privilege over many recordings and provided edited transcripts rather than the actual audio for some conversations. The transcripts that were released contained numerous gaps and deletions, including an infamous 18.5 minute gap in a crucial conversation between Nixon and Chief of Staff H.R. Haldeman. What the public could hear on the released tapes was damaging enough, revealing a president who regularly used profanity, made crude and sometimes racist comments, and appeared to be directly involved in discussions about covering up the Watergate break-in. The tapes showed Nixon discussing payments to the burglars, strategies for limiting the investigation, and ways to use government agencies to protect his administration. One of the most damaging recordings was from June 23, 1972, just 6 days after the break-in, in which Nixon could be heard instructing Haldeman to have the CIA claim that a full FBI investigation of Watergate would compromise national security operations. This smoking gun tape provided clear evidence that Nixon had been involved in obstructing justice from the very beginning of the scandal. The release of the tapes also revealed the existence of a secret White House fund that had been used to pay for various intelligence operations, including the Watergate break-in. This evidence demonstrated that the illegal activities were not the work of rogue operatives, but were part of systematic abuse of power by the highest levels of government. As evidence of Nixon's involvement in Watergate and the cover-up mounted, the House of Representatives began formal impeachment proceedings under the leadership of Judiciary Committee Chairman Peter Rodino. The committee's hearings, conducted in a deliberate and bipartisan manner, examined evidence of presidential misconduct and debated whether Nixon's actions constituted high crimes and misdemeanors, warranting removal from office. The impeachment inquiry focused on three main areas of presidential misconduct: obstruction of justice in the Watergate investigation, abuse of power through the use of government agencies for political purposes, and contempt of Congress for refusing to comply with subpoenas for evidence. Each charge was supported by extensive evidence gathered during the various investigations of the Nixon administration. The Judiciary Committee ultimately approved 3 articles of impeachment, with several Republican members joining Democrats in voting for at least some of the charges. The bipartisan nature of the impeachment vote was significant, as it demonstrated that opposition to Nixon's actions transcended party lines and reflected genuine concern about presidential misconduct. However, Nixon resigned before the full House could vote on the impeachment articles, making him the first president in American history to resign from office. His resignation came after Republican congressional leaders informed him that he lacked sufficient support in Congress to avoid conviction and removal from office. Following Nixon's resignation, many of his top advisors and campaign officials were prosecuted and convicted for their roles in the Watergate conspiracy and cover-up. These prosecutions demonstrated that the rule of law applied even to the highest levels of government and that official position could not protect individuals from accountability for criminal conduct. John Mitchell, the former Attorney General and campaign director, was convicted of conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and perjury, receiving a sentence of 2.5 to 8 years in prison. Mitchell's conviction was particularly significant given his former role as the nation's chief law enforcement officer. H.R. Haldeman and John Ehrlichman, Nixon's closest White House advisors, were both convicted of conspiracy and obstruction of justice and sentenced to prison terms. Their convictions demonstrated that even the president's most trusted advisors could not escape accountability for their actions. John Dean, who had been White House counsel, cooperated with prosecutors and received a reduced sentence in exchange for his testimony against other participants in the conspiracy. Dean's cooperation was crucial in establishing the scope of the conspiracy and the involvement of high-level officials. More than 40 individuals were ultimately convicted of crimes related to Watergate and other Nixon administration scandals, including members of the Plumbers Unit and various campaign officials who had participated in illegal activities. These convictions demonstrated the extensive nature of the corruption that had characterized the Nixon administration. The Watergate scandal had profound and lasting effects on American politics and government, fundamentally changing how Americans viewed their political leaders and institutions. The revelation that a president had engaged in criminal conduct and had systematically abused the powers of office shattered many Americans' trust in government and created a cynicism about political leaders that persists to this day. Congress responded to Watergate by passing a series of reforms designed to prevent future abuses of power and increase transparency in government operations. These reforms included the Ethics in Government Act, which established procedures for appointing special prosecutors to investigate high-level misconduct, and amendments to campaign finance laws designed to reduce the influence of money in politics. The scandal also led to increased congressional oversight of executive branch activities and a more assertive role for Congress in checking presidential power. The imperial presidency that had characterized much of the post-World War II era was replaced by a more constrained executive that faced greater scrutiny from both Congress and the media. Watergate also changed the relationship between the presidency and the news media, with journalists becoming more skeptical of official claims and more aggressive in investigating government activities. The success of Woodward and Bernstein in exposing the Watergate conspiracy inspired a generation of investigative reporters and established new standards for political journalism. Watergate represented the most serious constitutional crisis in American history since the Civil War, testing whether the system of checks and balances could function effectively when a president engaged in criminal conduct and attempted to abuse the powers of office to protect himself from accountability. The crisis demonstrated both the strengths and weaknesses of American democratic institutions. On one hand, the system ultimately worked, with Congress, the courts, and the press all playing crucial roles in exposing presidential misconduct and holding the administration accountable. The resignation of the president showed that no one, not even the most powerful official in the country, was above the law. On the other hand, the scandal revealed how vulnerable democratic institutions could be to abuse by determined officials willing to use the powers of government for political purposes. The fact that so many illegal activities had been conducted for so long without detection highlighted the need for stronger oversight mechanisms and more robust protections for democratic norms. The resolution of the constitutional crisis through Nixon's resignation rather than impeachment and removal also left some questions unanswered about the limits of presidential power and the appropriate remedies for executive misconduct. Frank Wills, the security guard whose vigilance led to the discovery of the Watergate break-in, became an unlikely hero whose actions changed the course of American history. However, Wills did not benefit significantly from his role in exposing the scandal and struggled financially in the years following Watergate. Despite his crucial contribution to uncovering one of the most important political scandals in American history, Wills found it difficult to capitalize on his fame and spent his later years working various security jobs while dealing with personal and financial difficulties. He died in 2000 at the age of 52, largely forgotten by the public whose democracy he had helped preserve. Will's story serves as a reminder that some of the most important moments in history can turn on the actions of ordinary individuals who simply do their jobs conscientiously and refuse to ignore obvious signs that something is wrong. His decision to call the police when he discovered the taped door latches demonstrated how individual integrity and attention to duty can have enormous consequences. The long-term consequences of Watergate extended far beyond the immediate political fallout and continued to influence American politics and government for decades. The scandal created lasting changes in how Americans view their political leaders, with polls consistently showing lower levels of trust in government since the 1970s. Watergate also established important precedents for investigating and prosecuting political corruption, including the use of special prosecutors, congressional oversight, and aggressive investigative journalism. These tools have been used repeatedly in subsequent decades to investigate various scandals and allegations of misconduct by high-level officials. The scandal influenced campaign finance reform efforts and led to various attempts to reduce the influence of money in politics, though many observers argue that these reforms have been only partially successful. The revelation that campaign funds had been used to finance illegal activities led to increased scrutiny of political fundraising and spending. Watergate also had international implications, damaging America's reputation abroad and undermining U.S. credibility during the Cold War. The scandal occurred during a period of détente with the Soviet Union and came at a time when American foreign policy was already under scrutiny due to the Vietnam War. The Watergate break-in of June 17, 1972, began as what appeared to be a minor burglary, but evolved into the most significant political scandal in American history, ultimately bringing down a presidency and fundamentally changing how Americans view their government and political leaders. What started with Frank Wills's discovery of tape on door latches ended with the resignation of President Richard Nixon and the conviction of numerous high-level officials for their roles in a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of government. The scandal demonstrated both the vulnerability of democratic institutions to abuse by determined officials and the ultimate strength of the American system of checks and balances when faced with presidential misconduct. The role played by Congress, the courts, the press, and ordinary citizens like Frank Wills showed that democracy could police itself when its institutions functioned properly and when individuals were willing to do their duty regardless of the personal cost. The investigation of Watergate revealed a pattern of illegal activities that went far beyond the original break-in, including other burglaries, surveillance operations, abuse of government agencies, and systematic attempts to obstruct justice. These revelations showed that the break-in was not an isolated incident, but part of a broader assault on democratic norms and the rule of law. The legacy of Watergate continues to influence American politics today, serving as both a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked presidential power and a reminder that democratic institutions can ultimately prevail when faced with threats from within. The scandal established important precedents for investigating political corruption and holding high-level officials accountable for their actions. The empty offices of the Democratic National Committee at the Watergate complex may seem unremarkable today, but they were the site where American democracy faced one of its greatest tests and ultimately proved its resilience. The break-in that was intended to give one political party an advantage over another instead exposed the corruption that threatened the foundation of democratic government and led to reforms that strengthened the system's ability to police itself. Frank Will's discovery of those pieces of tape on the door latches proved that sometimes the most significant moments in history turn on the smallest details and the actions of individuals who simply refuse to ignore evidence that something is wrong. His vigilance that night in 1972 set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately preserve American democracy and demonstrate that in a free society, no one, not even the president, is above the law. Story 3, the Pizza Connection Trial, the 1980s. In the annals of organized crime prosecutions, few cases have been as complex, far-reaching, or culturally significant as the Pizza Connection Trial of the mid-1980s. This massive federal prosecution exposed a sophisticated international drug trafficking network that used pizza parlors across the United States as fronts for one of the largest heroin distribution operations in American history. The case revealed unprecedented cooperation between traditional American mafia families and their Sicilian counterparts, creating a transatlantic criminal enterprise that generated hundreds of millions of dollars in illegal profits. The investigation, which began with routine surveillance of suspected money laundering activities, eventually uncovered a network that stretched from the poppy fields of Turkey and the laboratories of Sicily to pizzerias in small towns across America. The case would ultimately result in the longest criminal trial in American history at that time, lasting 17 months and involving 35 defendants, hundreds of witnesses, and evidence that filled an entire warehouse. More than just a drug case, the Pizza Connection trial provided unprecedented insights into the structure and operations of modern organized crime while demonstrating law enforcement's growing sophistication in combating international criminal networks. The Pizza Connection network emerged from the convergence of several factors in the international drug trade during the 1970s and early 1980s. The traditional French Connection heroin pipeline, which had channeled drugs from Turkey through France to the United States, had been largely dismantled by international law enforcement efforts. This created opportunities for new smuggling routes and criminal organizations to fill the void in the lucrative American heroin market. Sicilian mafia groups, with their long history of involvement in international smuggling and their connections to both legitimate businesses and criminal organizations around the world, were perfectly positioned to exploit these opportunities. The Sicilian mafia had undergone significant changes during the post-World War II period, evolving from rural protection rackets into sophisticated criminal organizations capable of managing complex international operations. The connection to American organized crime families was facilitated by historical ties between Sicilian and American criminals that dated back to the early 20th century, when many members of both groups had immigrated to the United States from the same regions of Sicily. These family and regional connections provided the foundation for trust and cooperation that was essential for managing large-scale international criminal enterprises. The choice of pizza parlors as fronts for the drug operation was both practical and inspired. Pizza had become enormously popular in America during the 1970s, creating legitimate demand for Italian restaurants and businesses that could provide cover for criminal activities. The cash-intensive nature of the restaurant business also made it an ideal vehicle for money laundering, as large amounts of cash could be explained as legitimate business income. At the heart of the Pizza Connection network were several powerful Sicilian mafia families, led by the Contreras, the Caruana family, and other groups based in the Palermo region. These organizations had developed sophisticated capabilities for producing and smuggling heroin, building on decades of experience in international contraband trafficking. The Sicilian groups controlled the production side of the operation, managing relationships with Turkish suppliers who provided the raw opium, overseeing processing laboratories that converted the opium into heroin, and coordinating the complex logistics required to transport large quantities of drugs across international borders without detection. Gaetano Badalamenti emerged as one of the key figures on the Sicilian side of the operation. A former boss of the Sinisi mafia family, Badalamenti had been forced into exile from Sicily due to conflicts with rival families, but had maintained extensive criminal connections and had adapted to operating in an international environment. The Sicilian organizations brought several crucial advantages to the partnership. They had access to high-quality heroin through their Turkish connections. They controlled sophisticated processing facilities that could produce large quantities of pure drugs. And they had developed smuggling routes and methods that had proven effective against European law enforcement agencies. Perhaps most importantly, the Sicilian groups brought a level of discipline and operational security that was often lacking in American criminal organizations. Their experience operating in the hostile environment of Sicily, where law enforcement pressure was intense and rival families posed constant threats, had taught them the importance of compartmentalization, careful communication procedures, and maintaining low profiles. The American side of the Pizza Connection network was built around several traditional mafia families, particularly the Bonanno and Gambino families in New York, which had maintained relationships with Sicilian criminals through immigration and family ties. However, the network also included individuals and groups from various other backgrounds who were attracted by the enormous profits available in heroin trafficking. Salvatore Sal Catalano served as a crucial link between the Sicilian suppliers and the American distribution network. Born in Sicily but raised in New York, Catalano had connections to both criminal communities and was able to facilitate cooperation between groups that might otherwise have been suspicious of each other. The American network included both traditional organized crime figures and individuals who were attracted to the drug trade by its profitability rather than by family or cultural connections to organized crime. This diversity reflected the broader changes in organized crime during the 1970s and 1980s, as traditional ethnic boundaries became less important than business relationships and profit opportunities. The pizza parlors that gave the network its name served multiple functions in the criminal enterprise. They provided legitimate business fronts that could explain the presence of large amounts of cash. They offered meeting places where criminal associates could gather without attracting attention, and they created opportunities for money laundering through the manipulation of business records and financial transactions. Many of the pizzerias were located in small towns and suburban areas rather than in major cities, reflecting a deliberate strategy to avoid the intense law enforcement scrutiny that criminal organizations faced in traditional strongholds like New York and Chicago. The choice of smaller communities also provided operational advantages, as local law enforcement agencies often lacked the resources and expertise to detect sophisticated criminal operations. The Pizza Connection Network operated one of the most sophisticated drug trafficking pipelines ever documented by law enforcement agencies. The operation began with the acquisition of raw opium from suppliers in Turkey, where poppy cultivation had been a traditional agricultural activity for centuries, but where weak government control and economic instability had created opportunities for criminal exploitation. The Turkish opium was transported to processing laboratories in Sicily, where it was converted into high-grade heroin using advanced chemical processes and equipment. The Sicilian laboratories were typically located in remote rural areas where they could operate without detection, and they were staffed by experienced chemists who could produce heroin with purity levels much higher than those typically available on American streets. The finished heroin was then smuggled into the United States using a variety of methods and routes designed to minimize the risk of detection by customs and other law enforcement agencies. The smuggling operations involved legitimate businesses, including shipping companies and import/export firms that could provide cover for moving large quantities of contraband across international borders. Once the heroin reached the United States, it was distributed through a network of pizza parlors and other businesses that served as both storage facilities and distribution points. The network was designed with multiple layers of insulation between the top-level organizers and the street-level dealers, making it difficult for law enforcement agencies to penetrate the organization or gather evidence against its leaders. The financial aspects of the operation were equally sophisticated, involving complex money laundering schemes that used legitimate businesses, offshore banks, and other financial institutions to convert drug profits into apparently legitimate assets. The cash-intensive nature of the restaurant business provided an ideal cover for these money laundering activities. The investigation that would eventually expose the Pizza Connection network began in the early 1980s with routine surveillance and intelligence gathering by various law enforcement agencies. The Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, the FBI, and other agencies had noticed patterns of suspicious activity involving Italian-American criminals and businesses. But the full scope of the network was not immediately apparent. The breakthrough came when investigators began to connect seemingly unrelated cases and activities in different parts of the country. Surveillance of suspected money laundering operations in New York led to the identification of individuals who had connections to pizza parlors in other states. These connections, in turn, led to the discovery of a much larger and more sophisticated criminal network than anyone had initially suspected. Louis Freeh, who would later become FBI director, played a crucial role in the early stages of the investigation as a federal prosecutor in New York. Freeh recognized the potential significance of the case and helped coordinate the efforts of multiple law enforcement agencies to build a comprehensive understanding of the network's structure and operations. The investigation was complicated by the international nature of the network and the need to coordinate with law enforcement agencies in multiple countries. Information sharing between American and European agencies was often difficult and time-consuming, and differences in legal systems and investigative procedures created additional challenges. However, the investigators were aided by technological advances that allowed for more sophisticated surveillance and communication interception than had been available in previous decades. Wiretaps, electronic surveillance, and other intelligence-gathering methods provided crucial insights into the network's operations and helped investigators map the relationships between various participants. As the investigation progressed, law enforcement agencies began to understand the enormous scope of the Pizza Connection network. The operation was estimated to have imported and distributed between $1.60 and $5 billion worth of heroin over the course of several years, making it one of the largest drug trafficking operations in American history. The network included more than 200 pizzerias and other businesses across the United States, with concentrations in New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Illinois, and other states with significant Italian-American populations. However, the network also extended to smaller communities in the Midwest and other regions where the criminal connections were less obvious to local law enforcement. The international connections were equally extensive, involving criminal organizations in Sicily, Turkey, Switzerland, Brazil, and other countries. The network demonstrated a level of international coordination and sophistication that was unprecedented in American organized crime cases and provided insights into the globalization of criminal enterprises. The financial investigations revealed complex money laundering operations that involved dozens of banks, businesses, and financial institutions in multiple countries. The network had developed sophisticated methods for converting drug profits into legitimate assets while avoiding detection by financial regulators and law enforcement agencies. Perhaps most significantly, the investigation revealed the extent of cooperation between traditional American mafia families and their Sicilian counterparts. This cooperation went beyond simple business relationships to include shared operational planning, personnel exchanges, and coordination of activities across international boundaries. The Pizza Connection investigation made extensive use of electronic surveillance and wiretapping, representing one of the most comprehensive electronic intelligence gathering operations in the history of American law enforcement. The surveillance efforts required coordination between multiple agencies and jurisdictions, as well as sophisticated technical capabilities to monitor communications across international boundaries. The wiretaps provided investigators with unprecedented insights into the daily operations of the criminal network, including conversations about drug shipments, money laundering activities, and internal disputes within the organization. The recorded conversations revealed the casual attitude that many participants had toward violence and illegal activities, as well as the sophisticated business-like approach they took to managing their criminal enterprises. One of the most significant challenges faced by investigators was the multilingual nature of the communications, as participants often spoke in Sicilian dialects, Italian, and various forms of coded language designed to avoid detection. The FBI had to recruit native speakers and dialect experts to translate and interpret the intercepted conversations, creating a massive translation and analysis operation. The surveillance also revealed the extent to which the network had penetrated legitimate businesses and institutions. Phone conversations included discussions with bankers, lawyers, accountants, and other professionals who were either knowingly or unknowingly facilitating the criminal activities. The electronic surveillance was supplemented by physical surveillance operations that tracked the movements of key participants and documented their meetings and activities. These operations required enormous resources and coordination, as investigators had to maintain surveillance on dozens of individuals across multiple states and countries. Following the money proved to be one of the most complex and crucial aspects of the Pizza Connection investigation, as prosecutors needed to demonstrate how the network converted drug profits into legitimate assets while evading detection by financial institutions and regulatory agencies. The money laundering operations involved multiple layers of transactions designed to obscure the source of the funds and make them appear to be legitimate business income. The network used pizza parlors and other cash-intensive businesses to justify large cash deposits while also employing more sophisticated financial instruments and offshore banking arrangements. Investigators discovered that the network had relationships with financial institutions in Switzerland, the Cayman Islands, and other countries known for bank secrecy laws that made it difficult for American authorities to trace financial transactions. These offshore arrangements allowed the organization to move large amounts of money across international boundaries while maintaining a degree of anonymity and protection from law enforcement scrutiny. The financial investigations also revealed the enormous scale of the operation's profits. Conservative estimates suggested that the network had generated hundreds of millions of dollars in illegal income, making it one of the most profitable criminal enterprises in American history. The wealth generated by the operation allowed participants to live lavish lifestyles while also providing resources for expanding and protecting their criminal activities. The complexity of the financial arrangements required investigators to develop new techniques and expertise in tracking international money movements and understanding sophisticated financial instruments. The case helped establish new precedents for financial investigations and provided valuable experience that would be applied to future organized crime and white-collar crime cases. The culmination of the Pizza Connection investigation came with a series of coordinated arrests in April 1984, when federal agents simultaneously arrested dozens of participants in the network across multiple states. The arrests were carefully coordinated to prevent key figures from fleeing or destroying evidence, and they represented the largest organized crime roundup in American history at that time. Among those arrested was Gaetano Badalamenti, the former Sicilian mafia boss who had been living in Brazil under an assumed identity. Badalamenti's arrest required extensive international cooperation and demonstrated the global reach of American law enforcement efforts to combat organized crime. Salvatore Catalano and other key American participants were arrested at their homes and businesses, often while conducting routine activities that demonstrated how successfully they had integrated their criminal enterprises into apparently legitimate lifestyles. The arrest revealed the extent to which the network had penetrated legitimate business communities in various parts of the country. The arrests were accompanied by extensive searches and seizures that yielded enormous amounts of evidence, including business records, communications equipment, and large quantities of cash and drugs. The evidence collection efforts required coordination between dozens of law enforcement agencies and created logistical challenges that tested the limits of the federal court system. Many of the arrested individuals initially maintained their innocence and claimed that they were legitimate businessmen who had been wrongly targeted by law enforcement agencies. However, the overwhelming evidence gathered during the investigation made it difficult for most defendants to maintain these claims as the case proceeded to trial. The Pizza Connection trial began on September 30th, 1985, in federal court in Manhattan under Judge Pierre Laval. The trial would eventually become the longest criminal trial in American history at that time, lasting 17 months and involving testimony from more than 350 witnesses, including former members of the criminal network who had agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for reduced sentences. The scope and complexity of the case created unprecedented challenges for all participants in the judicial process. The prosecution team, led by Louis Freeh and other experienced federal prosecutors, had to present evidence involving dozens of defendants, hundreds of criminal acts, and complex financial transactions that spanned multiple countries and several years. The defense strategy varied among the different defendants, with some claiming complete innocence, while others acknowledged involvement in some illegal activities, but denied participation in the broader conspiracy. The large number of defendants and their different legal strategies created conflicts and complications that tested the limits of the adversarial legal system. Judge Laval faced enormous challenges in managing such a complex case while ensuring that all defendants received fair trials. The judge had to make numerous rulings on evidence, coordinate the schedules of dozens of attorneys, and maintain order in a courtroom filled with defendants, lawyers, interpreters, and observers from around the world. The trial attracted enormous media attention, both because of its unprecedented scope and because it provided unique insights into the operations of modern organized crime. Television networks, newspapers, and magazines provided extensive coverage of the proceedings, making the Pizza Connection trial one of the most closely watched criminal cases of the 1980s. The prosecution's case relied heavily on the electronic surveillance evidence gathered during the multi-year investigation, including hundreds of hours of wiretapped conversations that documented the network's operations in unprecedented detail. The wiretaps provided direct evidence of criminal planning and coordination that would have been impossible to obtain through traditional investigative methods. Financial evidence played a crucial role in demonstrating the scope and profitability of the criminal enterprise. Prosecutors presented detailed analyses of money movements, business transactions, and asset acquisitions that showed how the network had generated and laundered enormous profits from drug trafficking activities. Cooperating witnesses, including former participants in the network who had agreed to testify in exchange for reduced sentences, provided insider perspectives on the organization's structure and operations. These witnesses included both American and Sicilian criminals who could explain the cultural and organizational factors that had made the international cooperation possible. Physical evidence included drugs, weapons, communications equipment, and business records seized during the arrests and searches. The prosecution also presented evidence of the pizza parlors and other businesses that had served as fronts for the criminal activities, demonstrating how the network had successfully integrated illegal operations into apparently legitimate enterprises. Expert witnesses provided testimony about organized crime structures, drug trafficking methods, money laundering techniques, and other specialized topics that helped the jury understand the complex criminal enterprise. The prosecution also presented evidence about the broader impact of the network's activities on communities affected by heroin trafficking. The defense strategies in the Pizza Connection trial varied significantly among the 35 defendants, reflecting their different roles in the network and the varying strength of the evidence against each individual. Some defendants maintained complete innocence and claimed that they were legitimate businessmen who had been wrongly associated with criminal activities. Other defendants acknowledged some involvement in illegal activities, but denied participation in the broader conspiracy or claimed that they had been coerced or manipulated by more powerful criminal figures. These defendants sought to minimize their roles and sentences while avoiding the more serious charges related to drug trafficking and racketeering. Several defendants attempted to exploit cultural and linguistic differences to create reasonable doubt about their understanding of the activities in which they had participated. Defense attorneys argued that their clients had been confused by language barriers, cultural misunderstandings, or the complex nature of the criminal enterprise. The defense also challenged the government's use of electronic surveillance, arguing that wiretaps had been improperly obtained or that translations of conversations in Italian and Sicilian dialects were inaccurate or misleading. These challenges required extensive expert testimony about linguistic and legal issues that added to the complexity and length of the trial. Some defense attorneys attempted to portray their clients as victims of prosecutorial overreach, arguing that the government had been overzealous in its pursuit of Italian Americans and had relied on stereotypes and prejudices rather than solid evidence. However, these arguments were undermined by the overwhelming evidence of criminal activity that had been gathered during the investigation. After 17 months of trial and several weeks of deliberation, the jury returned verdicts on March 2, 1987, convicting most of the defendants on the major charges while acquitting a few individuals on some counts. The verdicts represented a major victory for federal prosecutors and demonstrated the effectiveness of sophisticated investigative techniques in combating complex international criminal enterprises. Gaetano Badalamenti was convicted on all charges and sentenced to 45 years in federal prison, effectively ensuring that he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. The severity of his sentence reflected both his leadership role in the network and the enormous harm caused by the organization's drug trafficking activities. Salvatore Catalano and other key American participants received substantial prison sentences ranging from 20 to 35 years, reflecting their central roles in the domestic operations of the network. These sentences were among the longest ever imposed in organized crime cases at that time and demonstrated the federal court's commitment to punishing drug trafficking severely. Many of the lower-level participants received shorter sentences, particularly those who had cooperated with investigators or who had played relatively minor roles in the network. However, even these sentences were substantial enough to deter future participation in similar criminal enterprises. The financial penalties were equally severe, with the government seizing millions of dollars in assets, including businesses, real estate, and other property that had been purchased with drug proceeds. The forfeiture actions demonstrated that crime did not pay and helped recover some of the enormous profits that the network had generated through its illegal activities. The Pizza Connection trial had profound and lasting effects on organized crime in America, demonstrating that even the most sophisticated international criminal networks could be penetrated and dismantled by determined law enforcement efforts. The case showed that traditional organized crime families could no longer operate with the impunity they had enjoyed in previous decades. The trial revealed the extent to which organized crime had evolved beyond its traditional ethnic and geographic boundaries to embrace international cooperation and sophisticated business practices. The cooperation between Sicilian and American criminal organizations demonstrated that modern organized crime was becoming increasingly globalized and businesslike in its approach. The sentences imposed on key participants sent a powerful message to other criminal organizations about the consequences of involvement in drug trafficking. The substantial prison terms and financial penalties made it clear that the profits from drug trafficking came with enormous risks that could result in the destruction of entire criminal enterprises. The case also highlighted the importance of international cooperation in combating organized crime, as the successful prosecution required coordination between law enforcement agencies in multiple countries. The Pizza Connection investigation helped establish precedents and procedures for future international criminal investigations. The Pizza Connection investigation represented a watershed moment in the development of modern law enforcement techniques for combating organized crime and international criminal networks. The case required investigators to develop new methods for gathering and analyzing evidence across multiple jurisdictions and countries. The extensive use of electronic surveillance and wiretapping in the case helped establish new standards and procedures for these investigative techniques. The challenges of monitoring communications in multiple languages and dialects led to the development of new translation and analysis capabilities that would be valuable in future cases. The financial investigations required the development of new expertise in tracing international money movements and understanding complex financial instruments used for money laundering. These capabilities would prove essential for combating not only organized crime, but also white-collar crime and terrorism financing in subsequent decades. The coordination required between multiple law enforcement agencies led to improved information sharing and cooperation that enhanced the effectiveness of future investigations. The case demonstrated the importance of breaking down traditional jurisdictional boundaries and bureaucratic barriers to combat sophisticated criminal enterprises. The Pizza Connection trial had significant cultural and social impacts beyond its immediate law enforcement consequences, challenging stereotypes about organized crime while also raising questions about ethnic profiling and discrimination in criminal investigations. The case demonstrated that organized crime had evolved far beyond the traditional images portrayed in popular culture, showing that modern criminal organizations were sophisticated business enterprises capable of operating on an international scale. The pizza parlor fronts showed how criminals could successfully integrate illegal activities into legitimate businesses and communities. However, the case also raised concerns about the potential for ethnic and cultural stereotyping in law enforcement investigations. Critics argued that the focus on Italian-American businesses and communities could lead to discrimination against law-abiding individuals who shared ethnic backgrounds with the criminals. The extensive media coverage of the trial brought organized crime back into the public consciousness and influenced popular culture representations of criminal organizations. The case provided material for books, movies, and television shows that explored the intersection between organized crime and legitimate business. The Pizza Connection case had important international implications for law enforcement cooperation and the global fight against organized crime. The investigation required unprecedented coordination between American and European law enforcement agencies, establishing new precedents for international criminal investigations. The case demonstrated that criminal organizations were becoming increasingly international in scope and that effective law enforcement responses required similar international coordination. The success of the investigation helped build support for enhanced international cooperation in combating organized crime. The revelations about the network's operations in multiple countries led to increased scrutiny of international money laundering and drug trafficking activities. Several countries implemented new laws and regulations designed to make it more difficult for criminal organizations to exploit international banking and business systems. The case also highlighted the importance of addressing the source countries for drug production and trafficking, leading to increased international efforts to combat opium production in Turkey and heroin processing in Sicily. These efforts required diplomatic and law enforcement cooperation that went beyond traditional bilateral relationships. One of the most significant aspects of the Pizza Connection case was the cooperation between law enforcement agencies that had traditionally been rivals or had limited interaction. The investigation required the DEA, FBI, IRS, Customs Service, and other federal agencies to work together in unprecedented ways. This cooperation extended to state and local law enforcement agencies across the country, as the investigation involved activities in dozens of communities and required coordination with hundreds of local officers and investigators. The case demonstrated the importance of sharing information and resources across jurisdictional boundaries. The international cooperation required for the case helped establish new relationships and procedures that would be valuable for future investigations. The experience gained in working with foreign law enforcement agencies provided insights into different legal systems and investigative approaches. The success of the cooperative approach in the Pizza Connection case influenced the development of joint task forces and other multi-agency initiatives that became standard practice in combating organized crime and other complex criminal enterprises. The Pizza Connection trial provided numerous lessons for future organized crime investigations, particularly regarding the importance of long-term planning, resource allocation, and coordination between multiple agencies and jurisdictions. The case demonstrated the value of patient, methodical investigation that allows criminal networks to reveal their full scope and structure before arrests are made. The multi-year investigation provided much more comprehensive evidence than would have been possible with a more aggressive approach that prioritized quick arrests over thorough intelligence gathering. The financial investigation showed the importance of following the money trail in organized crime cases, as financial evidence often provides the most compelling proof of criminal conspiracy and the scope of illegal activities. The case helped establish new standards for financial investigations and asset forfeiture actions. The international aspects of the case highlighted the need for law enforcement agencies to develop expertise in international law, foreign legal systems, and cross-border cooperation procedures. The case showed that domestic law enforcement agencies could no longer operate in isolation from international developments. The Pizza Connection trial marked an important milestone in the decline of traditional organized crime in America, demonstrating that even the most sophisticated criminal organizations could be successfully prosecuted using modern investigative techniques and legal tools. The substantial sentences imposed on key participants removed important criminal leaders from their organizations and disrupted networks that had taken decades to develop. The financial penalties and asset forfeitures deprived criminal organizations of resources needed to maintain their operations and influence. The publicity generated by the trial also damaged the reputation and mystique of organized crime, making it more difficult for criminal organizations to recruit new members and maintain the loyalty of existing participants. The detailed evidence presented during the trial revealed the brutal and exploitative nature of organized crime behind its romanticized public image. However, the case also demonstrated the adaptability of organized crime, as criminal organizations responded to increased law enforcement pressure by becoming more decentralized, international, and sophisticated in their operations. The lessons learned from the Pizza Connection case influenced the evolution of organized crime as much as they influenced law enforcement approaches. The Pizza Connection case remains relevant to contemporary law enforcement efforts to combat international criminal networks, terrorism, and other sophisticated criminal enterprises. The investigative techniques and legal strategies developed for the case continue to influence modern criminal investigations. The case's emphasis on financial investigations and asset forfeiture has become increasingly important as criminal organizations have become more sophisticated in their money laundering activities. The experience gained in tracing international financial transactions provides valuable precedents for modern investigations. The international cooperation required for the Pizza Connection case helped establish frameworks and relationships that continue to be valuable for combating modern criminal threats that cross national boundaries. The case demonstrated that effective responses to international criminal activities require sustained cooperation between multiple countries and agencies. The case also provides important lessons about the challenges of investigating and prosecuting complex criminal conspiracies involving multiple defendants, jurisdictions, and legal systems. These lessons remain relevant for modern cases involving terrorism, cybercrime, and other contemporary criminal threats. The Pizza Connection trial stands as one of the most significant organized crime prosecutions in American history, exposing a sophisticated international criminal network that had successfully operated for years while generating hundreds of millions of dollars in illegal profits. The case demonstrated both the evolution of organized crime into a global phenomenon and the ability of law enforcement agencies to adapt their techniques and strategies to combat increasingly sophisticated criminal enterprises. The investigation that led to the trial required unprecedented cooperation between multiple law enforcement agencies and countries, establishing new precedents for international criminal investigations that continue to influence law enforcement practices today. The use of electronic surveillance, financial investigations, and long-term intelligence gathering created a model for future complex criminal investigations. The trial itself, lasting 17 months and involving 35 defendants, tested the limits of the American judicial system while providing unprecedented insights into the operations of modern organized crime. The evidence presented during the trial revealed the sophisticated business practices, international connections, and enormous profits that characterize the Pizza Connection network. The sentences imposed on key participants sent a powerful message about the consequences of involvement in international drug trafficking and organized crime. The substantial prison terms and financial penalties demonstrated that the profits from criminal activities came with enormous risks that could result in the destruction of entire criminal enterprises and the forfeiture of lifetime accumulations of wealth. Perhaps most importantly, the Pizza Connection case showed that no criminal organization, regardless of its sophistication, international reach, or historical success, was immune to investigation and prosecution by determined law enforcement efforts. The case proved that patient, methodical investigation, combined with international cooperation, could penetrate even the most secretive and well-protected criminal networks. The legacy of the Pizza Connection trial extends far beyond the specific prosecutions and sentences that resulted from the investigation. The case helped establish new standards for investigating international criminal networks, influenced the development of modern asset forfeiture laws, and demonstrated the importance of international cooperation in combating crime that crosses national boundaries. Today, the pizza parlors that once served as fronts for one of the largest drug trafficking networks in American history have largely returned to their legitimate purposes, serving communities across the country with no connection to their criminal past. However, the lessons learned from the Pizza Connection case continue to influence law enforcement efforts to combat international criminal networks, ensuring that the enormous investment of time, resources, and expertise that went into the investigation continues to pay dividends in the ongoing fight against organized crime. The Pizza Connection trial proved that justice could prevail even against the most sophisticated criminal enterprises, providing hope that democratic institutions and the rule of law could successfully confront and defeat criminal organizations that sought to corrupt and exploit society for their own profit. The case stands as a testament to the dedication and skill of the law enforcement officers, prosecutors, and other officials who worked tirelessly to expose and prosecute one of the most significant criminal conspiracies in American history. Story 4. Operation Greylord, the FBI's war on judicial corruption. In the summer of 1980, a young Chicago attorney named Terrence Hake walked into the offices of the Federal Bureau of Investigation with a story that would shock even seasoned investigators. Cook County's criminal court system was thoroughly corrupted by a web of bribery, case-fixing, and judicial misconduct that reached into the highest levels of the local judiciary. What began as one lawyer's crisis of conscience would evolve into Operation Greylord, the most extensive investigation of judicial corruption in American history, ultimately resulting in the conviction of 92 people, including 17 judges, 48 lawyers, 8 police officers, 10 deputy sheriffs, 8 court clerks, and 1 Illinois state legislator. The operation, whose code name was inspired by the wigs worn by British judges, would run for 6 years and expose a system of corruption so pervasive that justice in Chicago had essentially become a commodity to be bought and sold. The investigation revealed that case outcomes in Cook County criminal courts were routinely determined not by evidence or law, but by the size of bribes paid to judges, court clerks, and other officials. For the first time in American history, federal agents would pose as corrupt lawyers and judges, secretly recording hundreds of hours of conversations that documented the casual, systematic corruption of an entire judicial system. To understand the scope and significance of Operation Greylord, one must first understand the unique political and judicial culture that had developed in Chicago and Cook County over the course of many decades. The city's political machine, dominated by the Democratic Party and perfected under Mayor Richard J. Daley, had created a system where political loyalty often trumped competence and where personal relationships and financial considerations frequently influenced official decisions. This culture of accommodation and mutual benefit had extended deeply into the Cook County court system, where judges were elected rather than appointed, and where political connections often determined both judicial selection and career advancement. Many judges owed their positions to political sponsors who expected favors in return, while others simply became corrupted by the opportunities for financial gain that their positions provided. The corruption was facilitated by the court system's heavy caseload and informal procedures, which created numerous opportunities for improper influence while making it difficult for supervisors or outside observers to monitor individual cases closely. The sheer volume of cases processed through the criminal courts meant that most proceedings were brief and routine, allowing corrupt transactions to occur without attracting attention. Perhaps most importantly, the corruption had become so normalized within the system that many participants viewed it as simply the way business was conducted rather than as serious criminal activity. Bribes were often described euphemistically as fees, contributions, or gifts, and the fixing of cases was treated as a routine service that lawyers could provide to their clients for appropriate compensation. Terrence Hake was an unlikely candidate to become the FBI's primary undercover operative in exposing judicial corruption. A graduate of Chicago's DePaul University Law School, Hake had begun his legal career with high hopes and genuine respect for the law, but had gradually become disillusioned as he witnessed the systematic corruption that pervaded the Cook County court system. Working as a criminal defense attorney in the early traffic courts, Hake had been approached by other lawyers who explained how cases could be fixed through payments to judges and court personnel. Initially resistant to these approaches, Hake found himself under increasing pressure to participate in the corrupt practices, both from colleagues who viewed his honesty as naive and from clients who expected him to use whatever means necessary to achieve favorable outcomes. The breaking point came when Hake realized that his refusal to participate in corrupt practices was actually harming his clients, who were receiving harsher sentences than defendants whose lawyers were willing to pay bribes. Faced with the choice between compromising his ethics or disadvantaging his clients, Hake began looking for a way to expose the corruption while protecting himself from retaliation. Hake's approach to the FBI was motivated by genuine outrage at the corruption he had witnessed, but also by practical concerns about his own legal vulnerability. He recognized that his knowledge of corrupt practices could potentially make him a target for prosecution if the federal government decided to investigate the court system, and he wanted to ensure that his cooperation would be recognized and protected. The FBI initially viewed Hake's allegations with some skepticism, as federal agents had heard rumors about corruption in Cook County courts for years, but had never been able to develop concrete evidence or reliable sources within the system. However, Hake's detailed knowledge of specific corrupt practices and his willingness to wear recording devices convinced investigators that he could provide the inside access necessary for a successful investigation. Operation Greylord officially began in September 1980 when Terrence Hake agreed to become an undercover operative for the FBI, wearing concealed recording devices to document corrupt transactions and conversations with judges, lawyers, and court personnel. The operation was supervised by FBI agent David Victor Reese, who recognized the unprecedented opportunity to expose systematic judicial corruption, but also understood the enormous challenges involved in investigating sitting judges and other court officials. The investigation required extraordinary secrecy and security measures, as any leak could not only compromise the operation, but also endanger Hake and other undercover operatives. The FBI established elaborate procedures for communicating with Hake, providing him with recording equipment, and protecting the evidence that was being gathered through his activities. Hake's role required him to gradually expand his participation in corrupt practices while secretly documenting the criminal activities of his colleagues and the judges before whom he appeared. This dual life created enormous psychological pressure, as Hake had to maintain his cover while secretly recording conversations with people he had known and worked with for years. The early recordings captured relatively minor instances of corruption, such as small bribes paid to court clerks to expedite case processing or to ensure favorable scheduling. However, as Hake's reputation as a cooperative lawyer grew, he was gradually introduced to more serious forms of corruption, including direct payments to judges in exchange for favorable rulings in criminal cases. The FBI supplemented Hake's undercover work with traditional investigative techniques, including surveillance of suspected corrupt officials, financial investigations of their assets and income, and the development of additional sources within the court system. However, the undercover recordings remain the core of the investigation, providing direct evidence of criminal activity that would have been virtually impossible to obtain through other means. As Operation Greylord progressed, investigators were shocked by the pervasiveness and systematic nature of the corruption they uncovered. The investigation revealed that case fixing was not limited to minor traffic violations or misdemeanor cases, but extended to serious felonies, including drug trafficking, robbery, and even murder. The corruption operated through several different mechanisms, each adapted to the specific characteristics of different types of cases in courts. In traffic court, where cases were processed quickly and in large volumes, corruption typically involved flat fees paid to judges or clerks for dismissing tickets or reducing charges. The efficiency of this system allowed corrupt officials to process numerous payoffs each day while maintaining the appearance of normal court operations. In criminal court, where cases were more serious and penalties more severe, the corruption was more sophisticated and expensive. Lawyers would pay substantial bribes to judges in exchange for favorable rulings on motions, reduced sentences, or outright dismissals of charges. The amounts involved could reach tens of thousands of dollars for serious felony cases, making judicial corruption extremely lucrative for participating judges. The investigation also revealed the existence of bagmen, intermediaries who collected bribes from lawyers and delivered them to judges, providing a layer of insulation that made it more difficult to prove direct corrupt relationships. These bagmen often included court clerks, bailiffs, or other court personnel who had regular access to judges and could facilitate corrupt transactions without attracting attention. Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery that some judges were not merely accepting bribes in individual cases, but were essentially auctioning off their services to the highest bidders. In some instances, competing lawyers would bid against each other for favorable rulings, with judges openly discussing the amounts they expected to receive for particular decisions. Operation Greylord succeeded in documenting corruption involving numerous high-profile judges and court officials, creating a comprehensive record of systematic criminal activity that spanned multiple courtrooms and involved dozens of participants. Judge John Devine became one of the operation's most significant targets when recordings captured him accepting bribes in exchange for favorable rulings in criminal cases. Devine, who had a reputation as a tough law and order judge, was recorded discussing specific amounts he expected to receive for particular rulings and was shown to be systematically selling his judicial decisions to the highest bidders. Judge Martin Hogan was another major target whose corrupt activities were extensively documented through undercover recordings. Hogan was captured on tape accepting substantial bribes for reducing sentences in serious felony cases and was shown to have developed elaborate procedures for receiving payments while maintaining plausible deniability. Judge Reginald Holzer was recorded accepting bribes and discussing the mechanics of case fixing with remarkable candor, apparently viewing corruption as a normal part of judicial business. His recorded conversations provided investigators with detailed insights into how the corrupt system operated and how corrupt officials justified their actions to themselves and others. The recordings also captured numerous lawyers who served as intermediaries in corrupt transactions, including some who specialized in particular types of cases or who had developed relationships with specific judges. These lawyers often boasted about their ability to fix cases and discuss their corrupt activities with a casualness that shocked federal investigators. Court clerks and other personnel were also extensively recorded, revealing their roles in facilitating corrupt transactions and in some cases initiating corrupt offers to lawyers who had not previously participated in such activities. These recordings showed how corruption had spread throughout the court system and had become institutionalized as a normal way of conducting business. As Operation Greylord progressed and investigators gained a better understanding of the scope of corruption in Cook County courts, the FBI decided to expand the undercover operation by recruiting additional operatives who could provide access to different areas of the court system and different types of corrupt activities. FBI agent David Victor Reese went undercover as a corrupt lawyer, using an assumed identity and a fabricated background to infiltrate circles of corrupt attorneys and judges. Reese's background in law enforcement provided him with unique insights into criminal cases and procedures, making his undercover persona more credible to targets who might have been suspicious of a typical lawyer-turned-informant. Robert Silverman, a disbarred attorney who had agreed to cooperate with the investigation, was used to make introductions and facilitate corrupt transactions with officials who might have been wary of dealing with unknown lawyers. Silverman's previous involvement in corrupt activities made him a credible source for information about how the system operated and who the key players were. The expansion of the undercover operation allowed investigators to document corruption in multiple courtrooms simultaneously and to corroborate information obtained through different sources. This multi-pronged approach also helped ensure that the investigation could continue even if one undercover operative was compromised or if targets became suspicious of particular individuals. The FBI also began using more sophisticated surveillance techniques, including hidden cameras in locations where corrupt transactions were known to occur. These visual recordings provided additional evidence beyond the audio recordings that had been the primary focus of the early investigation. One of the most difficult aspects of Operation Greylord was maintaining the cover of the undercover operatives while they documented increasingly serious criminal activities over an extended period. Terrence Hake, in particular, faced enormous pressure as he continued to practice law while secretly recording his colleagues and the judges before whom he appeared. The psychological strain of living a double life for several years took a significant toll on Hake, who had to constantly monitor his words and actions to avoid arousing suspicion while also gathering evidence of criminal activity. The stress was compounded by the knowledge that discovery could result not only in the end of his legal career, but potentially in physical retaliation from corrupt officials who had much to lose if their activities were exposed. Maintaining cover also required the undercover operatives to actually participate in corrupt activities, creating ethical and legal dilemmas about how far they could go in facilitating criminal conduct for the sake of gathering evidence. The FBI established strict guidelines about what activities were permissible, but the operatives often had to make split-second decisions about how to respond to corrupt offers without blowing their cover. The long duration of the investigation created additional challenges, as targets had multiple opportunities to observe the behavior of undercover operatives and potentially detect inconsistencies or suspicious patterns. The FBI had to constantly adjust tactics and procedures to ensure that the investigation remained secret while continuing to gather evidence. The success of the operation required not only the skill and dedication of the undercover operatives, but also extensive support from FBI technical specialists, surveillance teams, and analysts who worked behind the scenes to ensure that evidence was properly collected and preserved. The climax of Operation Greylord came in August 1983, when federal agents conducted a series of coordinated arrests that stunned the Chicago legal community and sent shockwaves throughout the city's political establishment. The arrests were carefully choreographed to prevent targets from destroying evidence or fleeing, and they were accompanied by search warrants that yielded additional evidence of corrupt activities. The scope of the arrests was unprecedented in American legal history, with federal agents simultaneously arresting judges, lawyers, court clerks, and other court personnel in a massive roundup that effectively exposed the entire corrupt network that had been operating in Cook County courts. The arrest made front-page news across the country and established Operation Greylord as one of the most successful investigations of institutional corruption ever conducted. Judge John Devine was arrested at his home, where agents found evidence of his corrupt activities, including records of payments he had received from lawyers. His arrest was particularly significant because of his high profile and his reputation as a tough judge who was supposedly committed to law and order. Judge Martin Hogan was taken into custody at the courthouse, creating a dramatic scene as federal agents arrested a sitting judge in the building where he had been systematically selling his judicial decisions. The arrest sent a powerful message that no one was above the law, regardless of their position or influence. The arrest extended beyond judges to include numerous lawyers who had facilitated corrupt transactions, court clerks who had accepted bribes, and other personnel who had participated in the corrupt system. The breadth of the arrest demonstrated the systematic nature of the corruption and showed that the problem extended far beyond a few isolated bad actors. Many of those arrested expressed shock and claimed ignorance of any wrongdoing, apparently having become so accustomed to corrupt practices that they no longer recognized them as criminal activities. This reaction highlighted how normalized corruption had become within the Cook County court system. The prosecution of Operation Greylord cases required federal prosecutors to present complex evidence involving multiple defendants, numerous criminal acts, and sophisticated corrupt schemes that had operated over many years. The trials attracted enormous media attention and provided the public with detailed insights into how systematic corruption had operated within the court system. The prosecution's case relied heavily on the undercover recordings obtained during the investigation, which provided direct evidence of criminal agreements and corrupt transactions. These recordings were often dramatic and compelling, featuring defendants discussing corrupt activities in their own words and demonstrating their willing participation in criminal schemes. Judge John Devine's trial was one of the most closely watched, as it represented the first time in Chicago history that a sitting judge had been prosecuted for corruption in federal court. The evidence against Devine included numerous recordings of him accepting bribes and discussing corrupt transactions with remarkable candor. Devine's defense team argued that he had been entrapped by overzealous federal agents and that his recorded statements had been taken out of context. However, the overwhelming evidence of his corrupt activities, including specific instances where he had accepted bribes in exchange for favorable rulings, made it difficult for the jury to accept these arguments. Devine was ultimately convicted on multiple counts of racketeering, bribery, and mail fraud, receiving a sentence of 15 years in federal prison. His conviction sent a powerful message about the consequences of judicial corruption and helped establish important precedents for future prosecutions. Judge Martin Hogan also faced extensive evidence of corrupt activities, including recordings that showed him systematically accepting bribes for favorable rulings in criminal cases. His trial revealed the sophisticated methods he had developed for receiving payments while maintaining plausible deniability. Hogan's conviction on racketeering and bribery charges resulted in a sentence of 13 years in federal prison, reflecting the serious nature of his crimes and the damage he had done to public confidence in the judicial system. The trials of other defendants, including lawyers and court personnel, provided additional evidence of the systematic nature of the corruption and demonstrated how the corrupt network had operated across multiple courtrooms and different types of cases. Operation Greylord had immediate and lasting effects on the Cook County court system, forcing dramatic reforms in procedures, oversight, and accountability measures designed to prevent future corruption. The exposure of systematic corruption created a crisis of confidence that required comprehensive changes to restore public trust in the judicial system. The Illinois Supreme Court implemented new procedures for judicial selection and oversight, including enhanced background investigations for judicial candidates and improved monitoring of judicial conduct. These reforms were designed to identify potential corruption risks before they could develop into systematic problems. Court administration procedures were completely overhauled, with new safeguards implemented to prevent the types of corrupt transactions that had been documented during the investigation. Case assignment procedures were randomized to prevent lawyers from shopping for particular judges, and financial oversight of court operations was significantly enhanced. The state of Illinois also implemented new ethics training requirements for judges and court personnel, emphasizing the importance of maintaining integrity and the serious consequences of corrupt activities. These training programs were designed to ensure that all court personnel understood their ethical obligations and the legal penalties for violating them. Perhaps most importantly, the reforms included new procedures for reporting and investigating suspected corruption, with protections for whistleblowers and streamlined processes for addressing allegations of misconduct before they could develop into systematic problems. Operation Greylord had implications that extended far beyond Chicago and Cook County, influencing judicial reform efforts and corruption investigations throughout the United States. The success of the investigation demonstrated that even the most entrenched corrupt systems could be exposed and dismantled through determined law enforcement efforts. The investigative techniques developed during Operation Greylord, particularly the use of long-term undercover operations and sophisticated electronic surveillance, became models for subsequent investigations of institutional corruption. Federal law enforcement agencies applied these techniques to investigations of corruption in other cities and other types of institutions. The legal precedents established through the Greylord prosecutions clarified federal jurisdiction over judicial corruption and established important standards for proving corrupt intent and criminal conspiracy in cases involving public officials. These precedents made it easier for federal prosecutors to pursue corruption cases and provided clearer guidance about the types of evidence needed for successful prosecutions. The operation also influenced national discussions about judicial selection and oversight, with many states examining their own procedures for selecting judges and monitoring judicial conduct. The Chicago experience demonstrated the importance of rigorous oversight and accountability measures in maintaining public confidence in the judicial system. While Operation Greylord was widely praised as a successful law enforcement operation, it also had significant personal costs for many of the individuals involved, including both the corrupt officials who were prosecuted and the undercover operatives who risked their careers and safety to expose the corruption. Terrence Hake, whose courage in approaching the FBI had made the entire investigation possible, faced enormous personal and professional challenges as a result of his cooperation. His legal career was effectively ended, as his role as an undercover operative made it impossible for him to continue practicing law in Chicago's legal community. The psychological toll of living as an undercover operative for several years also had lasting effects on Hake, who struggled with the stress and isolation that resulted from his double life. The FBI provided some support and protection, but the personal costs of his cooperation were substantial and permanent. Many of the judges and other court officials who were convicted faced not only imprisonment, but also the complete destruction of their careers and reputations. While their corrupt activities clearly warranted punishment, the human consequences of their prosecutions were severe and affected not only the defendants, but also their families and communities. The operation also had broader effects on the Chicago legal community, as lawyers and judges who had not been involved in corrupt activities faced suspicion and scrutiny that made their professional lives more difficult. The atmosphere of distrust and suspicion that followed the revelations took years to dissipate. Operation Greylord's legacy extends far beyond the specific prosecutions and reforms that resulted from the investigation, influencing how Americans think about judicial corruption and the importance of maintaining integrity in democratic institutions. The operation demonstrated that systematic corruption could be exposed and prosecuted even when it involved powerful officials and entrenched institutional practices. The investigation established important precedents for federal prosecution of judicial corruption and provided a model for subsequent investigations of institutional misconduct. The techniques and legal strategies developed during Operation Greylord continue to influence law enforcement approaches to complex corruption cases. The reforms implemented in response to the investigation helped restore public confidence in the Cook County court system and provided models for other jurisdictions seeking to prevent and detect judicial corruption. The emphasis on transparency, accountability, and oversight became standard features of modern court administration. Perhaps most importantly, Operation Greylord served as a powerful reminder that democratic institutions depend on the integrity of the individuals who operate them, and that vigilant oversight and accountability measures are essential for maintaining public trust. The operation showed that no institution, regardless of its importance or prestige, is immune from corruption if appropriate safeguards are not maintained. Operation Greylord stands as one of the most significant and successful investigations of institutional corruption in American history, exposing systematic judicial corruption that had operated for decades while demonstrating law enforcement's ability to penetrate and dismantle even the most entrenched corrupt networks. The investigation's success resulted from the extraordinary courage of individuals like Terrence Hake, who risked their careers and safety to expose corruption, combined with the sophisticated investigative techniques and determination of federal law enforcement agencies. The operation revealed corruption so pervasive and systematic that it challenged fundamental assumptions about the integrity of American judicial institutions. The casual manner in which judges sold their decisions and lawyers facilitated corrupt transactions demonstrated how completely normal such activities had become within the Cook County court system, highlighting the dangers of allowing corrupt practices to become institutionalized. The prosecutions that resulted from Operation Greylord sent a powerful message that no public official, regardless of position or influence, is above the law. The conviction of 17 judges, 48 lawyers, and dozens of other court personnel demonstrated that systematic corruption would be met with serious consequences and helped restore public confidence in the principle that justice should not be for sale. The reforms implemented in response to the investigation provided important models for preventing and detecting judicial corruption, emphasizing the importance of transparency, accountability, and oversight in maintaining the integrity of democratic institutions. These reforms continue to influence court administration and judicial oversight practices throughout the United States. Perhaps most importantly, Operation Greylord demonstrated the crucial role that individual courage and integrity play in maintaining democratic institutions. The willingness of Terrence Hake and other cooperating witnesses to risk their careers and safety to expose corruption was essential to the investigation's success and serves as an inspiration for others who witness institutional misconduct. The empty courtrooms and judicial chambers where corrupt transactions once occurred routinely may now operate with greater integrity and oversight. But the lessons of Operation Greylord remain relevant as new challenges to institutional integrity continue to emerge. The investigation serves as a permanent reminder that democracy requires constant vigilance and that the price of justice is the ongoing commitment of individuals and institutions to maintain the highest standards of integrity and accountability. The legacy of Operation Greylord extends beyond the specific convictions and reforms it produced to encompass broader lessons about the importance of institutional integrity, the power of individual courage, and the ability of democratic systems to reform themselves when confronted with evidence of systematic corruption. The operation proved that even the most entrenched corrupt systems can be exposed and dismantled when dedicated individuals are willing to risk everything for the cause of justice. Story 5. The Ford Pinto Case, Corporate Homicide and the Price of Human Life. On August 10, 1978, three teenage girls, Lynn Marie Ulrich, 18, Donna Ulrich, 16, and their cousin Judy Ann Ulrich, 18, were driving north on U.S. Highway 33 near Goshen, Indiana, in a yellow 1973 Ford Pinto, when their car was struck from behind by a Chevrolet van. The impact, which should have been survivable, instead caused the Pinto's fuel tank to rupture and ignite, creating a fireball that killed all three young women. This tragic accident would become the catalyst for one of the most significant corporate criminal cases in American history, as prosecutors charged the Ford Motor Company with reckless homicide, the first time a major corporation had faced criminal charges for a defective product. The Pinto case would expose a corporate culture that had prioritized profits over human safety, revealing internal Ford documents that showed the company knew about the car's deadly fuel tank defect, but had calculated that paying lawsuit settlements would be cheaper than fixing the problem. The case would fundamentally change how America viewed corporate responsibility and would establish important precedents for holding corporations criminally accountable for decisions that resulted in deaths and injuries. The Ford Pinto was conceived in the late 1960s as Ford Motor Company's response to the growing popularity of small, fuel-efficient imported cars that were capturing an increasing share of the American automobile market. Under the leadership of company president Lee Iacocca, Ford launched an ambitious project to design and manufacture a subcompact car that could compete with imports while maintaining American manufacturing and design preferences. The Pinto project was driven by Iacocca's famous directive that the car should weigh no more than 2,000 pounds and cost no more than $2,000, creating the 2,000 inches rule that would govern the entire design and development process. This emphasis on weight and cost reduction would prove to have fatal consequences, as engineers were forced to make compromises that prioritize these metrics over safety considerations. The accelerated development timeline was another crucial factor in the Pinto's eventual problems. Ford wanted to bring the car to market quickly to compete with established imports, compressing the normal development cycle from the typical 43 months to just 25 months. This shortened timeline meant that many design decisions were made hastily and that there was insufficient time for comprehensive safety testing and design modifications. The Pinto's rear-end design became the source of its deadly defect. To meet the weight and cost requirements, engineers placed the fuel tank behind the rear axle in a location that made it vulnerable to puncture during rear-end collisions. The tank was positioned just 6 inches from the rear bumper, with inadequate protection from the differential housing, which had several sharp protrusions that could puncture the tank during an impact. When the Pinto was introduced to the American market in September 1970, it was marketed as an economical and stylish alternative to imported subcompacts. The car was initially successful, with Ford selling over 400,000 Pintos in its first year and eventually producing more than 3 million vehicles over the model's production run from 1971 to 1980. Almost immediately after the Pinto's introduction, Ford began receiving reports of rear-end collisions that resulted in fuel tank ruptures and fires. These incidents followed a distinctive pattern. Relatively low-speed rear-end impacts that would normally result in minor damage instead caused catastrophic fuel tank failures that led to serious injuries and deaths. The first documented case occurred in 1972 when a Pinto driven by Lily Gray was struck from behind by another vehicle near San Jose, California. The impact caused the Pinto's fuel tank to rupture, and the resulting fire killed Gray and seriously burned her passenger, Richard Grimshaw, who was 13 years old at the time. Grimshaw survived but suffered severe burns over 90% of his body and required more than 60 surgeries. Additional cases followed with disturbing regularity. By 1977, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, NHTSA, had documented at least 27 deaths and many more injuries associated with Pinto fuel tank fires following rear-end collisions. However, Ford consistently maintained that these incidents were isolated cases and that the Pinto met all applicable federal safety standards. The pattern of injuries was particularly horrific. Unlike typical automobile accident injuries, Pinto fire victims often suffered severe burns that resulted in prolonged suffering, extensive medical treatment, and permanent disfigurement. Many victims who survived the initial impact died later from their burn injuries, while others faced years of painful treatment and rehabilitation. Internal Ford documents later revealed that company engineers and executives were aware of the fuel tank problem from the early stages of the Pinto's development. Crash tests conducted before the car's introduction had demonstrated the tank's vulnerability to puncture during rear-end impacts, but the company decided to proceed with production without modifying the design. Perhaps the most damning evidence against Ford emerged in the form of an internal company document known as the Grush-Sonby Report, which later became famous as Ford's cost-benefit analysis of the Pinto fuel tank problem. This document, prepared by Ford engineers in 1973, represented a coldly calculating approach to human safety that shocked the public when it was revealed during subsequent litigation. The report estimated that fixing the Pinto fuel tank defect would cost Ford $137 million. Based on the cost of installing an $11 part in each of the approximately 12.5 million vehicles that would be affected by the modification. Against this cost, Ford calculated the potential savings from preventing deaths and injuries caused by fuel tank fires. Using federal government figures for the value of human life, $200,000 per death, serious injuries, $67,000 each, and property damage, $700 per vehicle, Ford estimated that the total benefit of fixing the fuel tank would be only $49.5 million. Since the cost of the fix, $137 million, exceeded the calculated benefits, $49.5 million, Ford concluded that it was not cost-effective to modify the Pinto's design. This cost-benefit analysis became a symbol of corporate callousness and the dehumanizing effect of reducing human life to statistical calculations. The document revealed that Ford had not only known about the Pinto's deadly defect, but had made a conscious decision to continue producing and selling cars that the company knew would kill and injure people. The report also demonstrated the inadequacy of government estimates for the value of human life, which failed to account for the true costs of death and injury to families and society. Critics argued that no amount of money could justify knowingly producing a defective product that would kill innocent people, regardless of the economic calculations involved. The first major legal challenge to Ford's Pinto design came in the civil trial of Grimshaw versus Ford Motor Company, which arose from the 1972 accident that had killed Lily Gray and severely burned 13-year-old Richard Grimshaw. The trial, which began in 1977, would provide the first public exposure of Ford's internal documents and decision-making process regarding the Pinto's fuel tank defect. The plaintiff's legal team, led by attorney Mark Robinson, faced the enormous challenge of proving that Ford had knowingly produced a defective product and that the company's decisions had directly caused their clients' injuries and death. This required obtaining access to internal Ford documents that the company was reluctant to release and demonstrating that alternative designs could have prevented the tragedy. The breakthrough came when Robinson's team obtained copies of Ford's internal crash test films and engineering reports that documented the Pinto's fuel tank problems. These materials provided compelling evidence that Ford had known about the defect before the car's introduction and had continued production despite the known safety risks. The trial featured dramatic testimony from former Ford engineers who described the company's decision-making process and the pressure they had faced to keep costs low and meet production deadlines. This testimony revealed a corporate culture that prioritized financial considerations over safety concerns and that discouraged engineers from raising safety issues that might delay production or increase costs. The cost-benefit analysis became a central focus of the trial, with Robinson's team arguing that Ford had essentially placed a price tag on human life and had decided that the lives of Pinto occupants were worth less than the cost of fixing the fuel tank defect. This argument resonated powerfully with the jury, who were horrified by Ford's coldly calculating approach to human safety. On February 6, 1978, the jury returned a verdict that stunned the corporate world. They awarded $560,000 in compensatory damages and $125 million in punitive damages, making it one of the largest product liability awards in history at that time. The punitive damage award, which was later reduced to $3.5 million on appeal, sent a powerful message that corporations could face severe financial consequences for knowingly producing dangerous products. The publicity generated by the Grimshaw trial and other Pinto litigation prompted the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration to launch a formal investigation into the safety of the Pinto's fuel system design. The investigation, which began in 1977, represented the most comprehensive federal examination of an automobile safety defect since the creation of NHTSA in 1970. The NHTSA investigation involved extensive crash testing, analysis of accident data, and review of Ford's internal documents and design decisions. The agency's crash tests confirmed that the Pinto's fuel tank was indeed vulnerable to rupture during rear-end collisions, and that alternative designs could have prevented these failures. The investigation revealed that Ford had conducted its own crash tests that demonstrated the fuel tank problem, but had not shared this information with federal regulators. This finding raised serious questions about the adequacy of the federal vehicle safety regulatory system and the extent to which manufacturers could be trusted to self-report safety problems. NHTSA's analysis of accident data showed that Pintos were significantly more likely to experience fuel tank fires and rear-end collisions than comparable vehicles from other manufacturers. The agency estimated that the defect had resulted in hundreds of deaths and injuries that could have been prevented with proper design modifications. The investigation also examined Ford's decision-making process and the company's cost-benefit analysis, which NHTSA officials found deeply troubling. The agency concluded that Ford had placed inadequate emphasis on safety considerations and had failed to take appropriate action when the company became aware of the fuel tank defect. Under mounting pressure from NHTSA's investigation, media coverage, and public outrage, Ford finally announced a recall of 1.5 million Pintos on June 9, 1978. The recall was voluntary, meaning that Ford announced it before NHTSA formally ordered the company to take action. But it was clear that federal regulators were prepared to mandate a recall if Ford had not acted voluntarily. The recall involved installing a plastic shield between the fuel tank and the differential housing to prevent puncture during rear-end collisions. The modification, which cost approximately $11 per vehicle, was essentially the same fix that Ford's engineers had identified years earlier, but which the company had decided was not cost-effective to implement. Ford's announcement of the recall was carefully worded to minimize the company's legal liability while complying with federal requirements. The company did not admit that the Pinto was defective, instead describing the recall as a precautionary measure designed to end public concern about the vehicle's safety. However, the timing of the recall announcement proved to be tragically ironic, coming just 2 months before the accident that killed the three Ulrich girls, and that would lead to Ford's criminal prosecution. The recall had been announced, but the modification had not yet been performed on most vehicles, including the 1973 Pinto involved in the Indiana accident. The recall process itself was slow and incomplete, with many Pinto owners failing to have the modification performed. Ford's notification efforts were criticized as inadequate, and the company was accused of not doing enough to ensure that owners understood the urgency of having their vehicles repaired. The death of the three Ulrich girls in the August 1978 accident prompted Elkhart County, Indiana prosecutor Michael Cosentino to take an unprecedented step, filing criminal charges against the Ford Motor Company for reckless homicide. This marked the first time in American history that a major corporation had been charged with criminal homicide in connection with a defective product. Cosentino's decision to pursue criminal charges was controversial and represented a dramatic expansion of corporate criminal liability. Traditional criminal law had focused on individual defendants who could form criminal intent and take criminal actions. But Cosentino argued that corporations could also be held criminally responsible for decisions that resulted in deaths. The charges were filed under Indiana's reckless homicide statute, which required prosecutors to prove that Ford had engaged in conduct that created a substantial risk of death and that the company had been aware of this risk but had consciously disregarded it. This legal theory was untested in the context of corporate product liability and created significant challenges for both prosecutors and defense attorneys. The case attracted enormous media attention and became a symbol of the broader debate about corporate responsibility and the adequacy of civil remedies for corporate misconduct. Supporters of the prosecution argued that criminal charges were necessary to deter corporate behavior that put profits ahead of human safety, while critics worried about the implications of applying criminal law to business decisions. Ford assembled a formidable legal team to defend against the criminal charges, led by prominent attorney James Neal, who had previously served as a federal prosecutor in the Watergate case. The company's defense strategy focused on arguing that the Pinto met all applicable federal safety standards and that the tragic accident was not the result of criminal conduct by Ford. The trial of Indiana versus Ford Motor Company began on January 7, 1980, in Winamac, Indiana, a small town that was chosen as the venue to avoid the intense media attention that would have surrounded the case in a larger city. The trial lasted 10 weeks and featured testimony from dozens of witnesses, including Ford engineers, accident reconstruction experts, and family members of the victims. Prosecutor Michael Cosentino faced the enormous challenge of proving that Ford's corporate decisions constituted criminal conduct under Indiana law. His strategy focused on demonstrating that Ford had known about the Pinto's fuel tank defect, had made a conscious decision not to fix the problem, and had continued to sell cars that the company knew were dangerous. The prosecution's case relied heavily on Ford's internal documents, including the cost-benefit analysis and crash test results that showed the company's knowledge of the fuel tank problem. Cosentino argued that Ford's decision to continue production despite this knowledge constituted reckless disregard for human life that warranted criminal punishment. The prosecution also presented evidence about the specific accident that killed the Ulrich girls, arguing that their deaths were a direct and foreseeable result of Ford's decision not to fix the fuel tank defect. Expert witnesses testified that the accident would have been survivable if the Pinto had been properly designed. Ford's defense team, led by James Neal, argued that the company had not engaged in criminal conduct and that the Pinto met all applicable federal safety standards. They contended that the accident was a tragedy but not a crime, and that Ford's decisions were reasonable business judgments made in good faith. The defense emphasized that the Pinto had passed all federal safety tests and that Ford had cooperated with government regulators throughout the development and production process. They argued that it was unfair to hold Ford criminally responsible for following federal standards that had been established by expert government agencies. The Ford Pinto criminal trial featured extensive expert testimony about automobile design, crash dynamics, and safety engineering that was crucial to both the prosecution and defense cases. This technical evidence was essential for helping the jury understand the complex engineering issues involved in the case and the significance of Ford's design decisions. The prosecution's expert witnesses included former Ford engineers who testified about the company's design process and the alternatives that could have been implemented to prevent fuel tank ruptures. These witnesses described how the fuel tank's location behind the rear axle made it vulnerable to puncture, and how relatively simple design modifications could have eliminated this vulnerability. Crash reconstruction experts testified about the specific accident that killed the Ulrich girls, explaining how the rear-end impact had caused the fuel tank to rupture and ignite. Their analysis showed that the accident forces were within the range that should have been survivable with proper fuel system design. Safety engineering experts provided broader context about automotive safety design principles and industry standards for fuel system integrity. They testified that Ford's design fell below accepted engineering practices and that the company had failed to implement known safety technologies that were available at the time. The defense countered with its own expert witnesses who argued that the Pinto's design was reasonable given the constraints of cost, weight, and federal regulations that existed when the car was developed. These experts testified that Ford had followed accepted engineering practices and that the fuel tank design met all applicable safety standards. Ford's experts also challenged the prosecution's accident reconstruction, arguing that the severity of the impact was greater than initially estimated and that no fuel system design could have prevented the tank rupture under those conditions. They contended that the accident was an unavoidable tragedy rather than the result of defective design. On March 13, 1980, after deliberating for 25 hours over 4 days, the jury returned a verdict of not guilty on all charges against Ford Motor Company. The acquittal was a significant victory for Ford and was seen as a validation of the company's argument that its conduct, while perhaps questionable from a moral standpoint, did not constitute criminal behavior under Indiana law. The jury's decision reflected the difficulty of applying criminal law concepts to corporate decision-making and the high burden of proof required for criminal convictions. While many jurors later indicated that they believed Ford had made poor decisions regarding the Pinto's safety, they concluded that the prosecution had not proven criminal intent beyond a reasonable doubt. However, the acquittal did not end Ford's legal troubles or vindicate the company's conduct in the eyes of the public. The trial had exposed extensive evidence of Ford's knowledge about the Pinto's defects and the company's decision to prioritize cost considerations over safety concerns, damaging Ford's reputation and contributing to ongoing civil litigation. The case established important precedents for corporate criminal liability, even though Ford was ultimately acquitted. The fact that prosecutors had been able to bring criminal charges against a major corporation for product-related deaths opened the door for future criminal prosecutions of corporate misconduct. The trial also influenced public attitudes toward corporate responsibility and the adequacy of civil remedies for corporate wrongdoing. Many observers concluded that the threat of criminal prosecution was necessary to deter corporations from making decisions that prioritize profits over human safety. While Ford avoided criminal conviction in the Indiana case, the company faced hundreds of civil lawsuits from Pinto accident victims and their families. These cases, filed throughout the 1970s and 1980s, resulted in substantial monetary awards and settlements that ultimately cost Ford far more than the $137 million that would have been required to fix the fuel tank defect. The Grimshaw case had established important precedents for product liability litigation against Ford, and subsequent cases built on these precedents to secure significant awards for Pinto victims. The combination of compensatory and punitive damages in these cases created enormous financial pressure on Ford to settle claims rather than face the uncertainty of jury trials. Many of the civil cases were settled out of court for undisclosed amounts, making it difficult to determine the total cost to Ford of the Pinto litigation. However, estimates suggest that the company ultimately paid several $100 million in settlements and judgments, far exceeding the cost of the modification that could have prevented the deaths and injuries. The civil litigation also kept the Pinto case in the public eye long after the criminal trial had ended, ensuring that Ford continued to face negative publicity and reputational damage associated with the defective design. This ongoing litigation contributed to Ford's decision to discontinue the Pinto model in 1980. Some of the most significant civil cases involve multiple victims or particularly sympathetic plaintiffs, such as children who had been severely burned in Pinto fires. These cases often resulted in substantial jury awards that reflected public outrage over Ford's conduct and sympathy for the victims. The Pinto case prompted significant changes in federal automobile safety regulations and oversight procedures designed to prevent similar problems in the future. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration implemented new testing protocols and reporting requirements that made it more difficult for manufacturers to hide safety defects. Congress also responded to the Pinto case by strengthening NHTSA's authority to investigate safety defects and mandate recalls. New legislation increased penalties for manufacturers who failed to report safety problems and gave regulators more tools to compel corporate cooperation with safety investigations. The case influenced the development of federal motor vehicle safety standards, particularly those related to fuel system integrity and crashworthiness. New standards required more rigorous testing of fuel systems and established specific performance criteria that vehicles must meet to be approved for sale. Industry-wide changes also resulted from the Pinto case, as other automobile manufacturers implemented more comprehensive safety testing and review procedures to avoid similar problems. The case served as a cautionary tale about the legal and reputational risks of prioritizing cost considerations over safety concerns. State governments also responded to the Pinto case by strengthening product liability laws and corporate criminal liability statutes. Many states made it easier for prosecutors to bring criminal charges against corporations and increased penalties for corporate misconduct that resulted in deaths or injuries. The Pinto case had profound effects on corporate culture and decision-making processes throughout American industry, not just in the automobile sector. The case demonstrated that corporations could face serious legal and reputational consequences for decisions that prioritize profits over safety, leading many companies to reevaluate their risk management and safety procedures. The exposure of Ford's cost-benefit analysis became a symbol of corporate callousness and led to widespread criticism of the practice of reducing human life to monetary calculations. Many companies abandoned or modified similar analytical approaches in favor of more comprehensive safety assessments that considered ethical and reputational factors as well as financial costs. The case also influenced corporate governance practices, as boards of directors and senior executives became more aware of their potential personal liability for safety-related decisions. Many companies implemented new oversight procedures and reporting systems designed to ensure that safety concerns were elevated to appropriate decision-making levels. Corporate ethics programs became more common and more sophisticated in the wake of the Pinto case, as companies recognized the need to provide clear guidance to employees about acceptable decision-making practices. These programs often specifically address the ethical issues raised by the Pinto case and emphasize the importance of prioritizing safety over short-term financial considerations. The Pinto case received extensive media coverage that shaped public perceptions of corporate responsibility and the automobile industry for decades. Investigative journalism played a crucial role in exposing the details of Ford's decision-making process and bringing the case to public attention. The magazine Mother Jones published an influential article in 1977 titled "Pinto Madness" that brought national attention to the fuel tank defect and Ford's cost-benefit analysis. This article, written by Mark Dowie, helped galvanize public opinion against Ford and contributed to the pressure for federal investigation and criminal prosecution. Television news coverage of the criminal trial and civil litigation kept the Pinto case in the public eye and reinforced negative perceptions of Ford's conduct. The dramatic nature of the evidence, particularly the cost-benefit analysis and crash test films, made for compelling television that captured public attention and outrage. The case became a popular subject for academic study and was featured in numerous business ethics courses and case studies. It served as a cautionary tale about the consequences of corporate decision-making that prioritize financial considerations over ethical concerns and human safety. Documentary films and books about the Pinto case helped ensure that the story remained in public consciousness and continued to influence discussions about corporate responsibility. These works often presented the case as a symbol of broader problems with corporate culture and regulatory oversight. The long-term consequences of the Pinto case extended far beyond Ford Motor Company to influence corporate behavior, legal doctrine, and regulatory policy throughout American society. The case established important precedents for corporate criminal liability and demonstrated that corporations could face serious consequences for safety-related misconduct. Product liability law was significantly influenced by the Pinto case, particularly in areas related to design defects and corporate knowledge of safety problems. Courts became more willing to hold manufacturers liable for design decisions that prioritize cost over safety, and juries became more willing to award substantial punitive damages in cases involving corporate misconduct. The case also influenced the development of corporate compliance programs and risk management systems designed to identify and address safety problems before they resulted in accidents and litigation. Many companies implemented new procedures for safety testing, defect reporting, and decision-making oversight that were directly influenced by lessons learned from the Pinto case. Regulatory agencies became more aggressive in investigating safety defects and more skeptical of manufacturer claims about product safety. The case demonstrated the need for independent verification of manufacturer safety testing and for more robust oversight of corporate decision-making processes. The Pinto case also had lasting effects on public trust in corporations and government regulators, contributing to broader skepticism about corporate claims and increased demand for transparency and safety-related decision-making. This shift in public attitudes influenced political and regulatory responses to subsequent corporate safety scandals. The Ford Pinto case stands as one of the most significant corporate accountability cases in American history, exposing a corporate culture that had prioritized profits over human safety and demonstrating the devastating consequences that could result from such decisions. The case revealed that Ford Motor Company had known about a deadly defect in the Pinto's fuel system, but had calculated that paying lawsuit settlements would be cheaper than fixing the problem, a decision that ultimately resulted in hundreds of deaths and injuries. While Ford was ultimately acquitted of criminal charges in the Indiana prosecution, the case established important precedents for corporate criminal liability and demonstrated that corporations could face serious legal consequences for safety-related misconduct. The extensive civil litigation that followed cost Ford far more than the original modification would have required, proving that the company's cost-benefit analysis had been both morally wrong and financially short-sighted. The case prompted significant changes in automobile safety regulations, corporate governance practices, and legal doctrine that continue to influence corporate behavior today. The Pinto case served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of reducing human life to statistical calculations and the importance of prioritizing safety over short-term financial considerations. Perhaps most importantly, the Pinto case demonstrated the power of determined prosecutors, investigative journalists, and civil attorneys to hold corporations accountable for their actions and to force changes in corporate behavior that government regulators had been unable or unwilling to mandate. The case showed that public pressure and legal accountability could overcome corporate resistance to safety improvements and could force companies to acknowledge their responsibilities to consumers and society. The legacy of the Pinto case extends beyond the specific legal and regulatory changes it prompted to encompass broader lessons about corporate responsibility, ethical decision-making, and the importance of protecting human life and safety. The case serves as a permanent reminder that corporations, regardless of their size or influence, must be held accountable for decisions that put profits ahead of human welfare. Today, the Ford Pinto serves as a symbol of corporate irresponsibility and a cautionary tale about the consequences of prioritizing financial considerations over human safety. While the specific technical issues that plague the Pinto have been resolved, the ethical and legal principles established by the case continue to influence corporate decision-making and regulatory oversight throughout American industry. The three young women who died in that Indiana highway accident in 1978 became unwitting catalysts for one of the most important corporate accountability cases in American history. Their tragic deaths helped expose corporate misconduct that had operated in secrecy for years and forced changes that have undoubtedly saved countless lives since then. In that sense, their deaths were not in vain, serving instead as a powerful reminder of the human cost of corporate irresponsibility and the ongoing need for vigilance in protecting public safety from those who would sacrifice human welfare for financial gain. Let the hush of the night wrap around you. And know this: some stories don't end. They drift. They dream. They wait for you to listen again. Good night.